There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a house when everyone inside it is pretending. Not the silence of sleep or of emptiness, the silence of performance, of held breath, of rooms dressed in rented finery and people dressed in borrowed names. In the last years of the 19th century, in the gilded drawing rooms of New York and Newport and London and Paris, that silence was everywhere. It had the texture of heavy damask. It smelled of hothouse orchids and French perfume, and the faintest trace of something underneath. Something nervous, something alert, something that knew the whole beautiful arrangement could come apart with one wrong word, one question asked too directly, one afternoon when the mail arrived before the servants could intercept it. This is a story about women who wanted more than the world had decided to give them. It is a story about money and titles and the peculiar human desire to be taken for something grander than what you were born. It is, in the end, a story about what a woman will do when every legitimate door is locked, and the extraordinary lengths some of them went to in order to find a key. Close your eyes. The year is 1895, the rooms are warm, the candles are lit, and somewhere, in a Fifth Avenue bedroom, a woman is choosing her name. If you were born into new money in America in the 1870s, you lived in a kind of splendour that was never quite comfortable. Your father's fortune was real enough. It arrived on the backs of railroad ties and oil wells and steel furnaces, in ledgers that ran to columns of figures so long they looked like geography rather than arithmetic. Your house was enormous. Your horses were the finest. Your dresses were ordered from Paris before Paris had finished making them, and none of it, not one square inch of it, guaranteed that the woman across the room at the ball would look at you with anything other than a polite and very careful blankness. That blankness was the signature expression of old money in Gilded Age New York. It was a skill, perfected over generations, that communicated without ever speaking the single most important social fact of the era, that there was a difference between people who had always had money and people who had recently gotten it. The distinction seems, from this distance, almost comically thin. Both groups lived in mansions, both had servants, both attended the same operas, and summered in the same Newport cottages and bought art from the same European dealers, but to the families whose Dutch and English ancestors had laid claim to the island of Manhattan before the Revolution, the smell of industrial money was unmistakable, and its presence was an intrusion. The fortress of old money New York had a single custodian, and her name was Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. She was known simply as Mrs. Astor, the definite article part of her title, as if there could be only one and she were it. She was not particularly charming. She was not known for warmth. What she possessed, and what made her perhaps the most powerful woman in the United States for 3 consecutive decades, was the thing that no amount of railroad profit could manufacture, the absolute and unquestioned certainty of her own position. Her ballroom held exactly 400 people. This was not an accident. It was a statement. The 400 names on her guest list were the 400 families worth knowing in America, worth knowing on her terms, by her standards, by the genealogical and social criteria that she and her social arbiter Ward McAllister had refined over years of careful sifting. If you were not on that list, you did not exist. Not in any way that could be remembered at a dinner table, not in any way that could be inherited. Ward McAllister was an interesting figure in this drama, the male choreographer of female social exclusion, a man from Georgia who had married into money and made it his life's work to define the boundaries of New York's upper class. He coined the phrase, the 400, and was at various points described as Mrs. Astor's social prime minister. He knew which families had been in New York long enough to qualify, and which had not. He knew the histories of the Dutch patroon families, the English merchant lineages, the old colonial fortunes that had survived revolution and financial panic alike. He administered this knowledge with the possessive care of a librarian who has memorized the catalogue and has no intention of letting anyone else handle the books. He was received everywhere that mattered, and he received, in return, the social prestige of being the person who decided who mattered. It was McAllister who most clearly articulated what the 400 represented. Not merely wealth, and not merely elegance, but a specific combination of both, sustained over a sufficient number of generations that the combination had become effortless. The true test was not what you had. It was what you did not need to try for. Old money moved through the world without visible effort because it had been doing this for long enough that effort was no longer required. New money could not purchase the quality of not needing to try. That quality was the exclusive product of time. The Vanderbilts were not on the list. This single fact, in the social arithmetic of 1880s New York, was both absurd and absolute. The Vanderbilt fortune was the largest private fortune in American history. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the family patriarch, had died in 1877, leaving behind a wealth so vast that his survivors spent the following decades mostly arguing about how to spend it. His grandsons built mansions that made the Astor townhouse look restrained. His daughter-in-law Alva, who had married into the family from a comfortable but undistinguished Alabama household, had arrived in New York with a mind as sharp as a ledger and an ambition as cold as the marble she chose for her floors. Alva Vanderbilt understood the problem precisely. Old New York did not dislike new money because it was new. Old New York disliked new money because it threatened the very concept of a ceiling. If the Vanderbilts could be admitted to Mrs. Astor's ballroom simply by virtue of their wealth, then what separated the Astors from the Vanderbilts, and the Vanderbilts from the butcher who was having a very good year? The ceiling existed to protect those already above it. The new money families were not so much excluded as they were contained, kept in a holding space of magnificent dinners and slightly less magnificent social acknowledgement, close enough to the summit to be dazzled and far enough below it to be controlled. What Alva understood, and what she eventually demonstrated with spectacular precision, was that the ceiling could be broken. Not pushed through, that would invite resistance. Broken, made irrelevant, rendered structurally unsound by an event so large, so undeniably impressive, so comprehensively attended that refusing to recognize it would make the refuser look foolish rather than exclusive. In March of 1883, she hosted a costume ball. The Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue had cost $3 million to build and had been modelled deliberately on a French chateau of the 16th century. The ball itself cost another $250,000. In today's terms, that figure approaches $8 million spent on a single evening. 1,200 guests were invited. The flowers alone cost $11,000. Alva dressed as a Venetian princess. One guest came armoured as a medieval knight. Another wore an outfit constructed entirely from cat fur, which was either a statement about extravagance or a warning about the sort of decisions that unlimited money can produce. The preparation for the ball had taken months. The mansion had been under construction for years, and Alva had overseen every decision with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the building was a weapon before it was a home. The architect Richard Morris Hunt had been given instructions that could be summarized as France, 16th century, nothing held back. The result was a chateau on Fifth Avenue that declared, in stone and marble and carved limestone, the specific ambition of its owner, not to live in New York society, but to define what New York society should aspire to look like. Visitors who entered its halls and stood beneath its carved ceilings understood, without needing to be told, that they were in the presence of an ambition that had no intention of being politely contained. The weapon in all of this was not the ball itself. The weapon was an invitation that was never sent. Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie, had been rehearsing a dance with friends to perform at the ball. When word of this reached Alva's social secretary, the reply was delivered with the particular devastation that only perfect politeness can achieve. Mrs. Vanderbilt would be delighted to receive Miss Astor, the secretary explained. But since Mrs. Astor had not yet called upon Mrs. Vanderbilt, as social protocol required the elder woman to do first, no invitation could be issued. The door was open. The hinge was a calling card. Mrs. Astor's carriage arrived the following afternoon. Her calling card was delivered on a silver tray. The invitation followed within the hour. It was the most expensive capitulation in New York social history, and it taught every new money family on Fifth Avenue a lesson that would shape the next 3 decades of American life. When the door will not open, you do not knock harder. You build a door that cannot be refused. But Alva's victory, complete as it was, had a limit. She had forced Mrs. Astor to come to her. She had planted her banner on the summit of New York society, and she had discovered in the years that followed that the summit was not actually the highest point. The summit of New York society, the 400 families, the great houses, the opera boxes, Newport cottages, and coming-out balls, was still, in the end, America, and America had a ceiling of its own. The ceiling was not a prejudice exactly. It was a structural fact. In a republic founded on the explicit rejection of hereditary rank, There was no formal mechanism for the kind of permanent social recognition that the European aristocracy provided as a matter of institutional architecture. An American millionaire could be very rich and very powerful and very well connected and very respected, but she could not, by any means available within the United States, become the holder of a title that the government itself recognized. The government had been specifically designed not to create such titles. The constitution that governed the country explicitly prohibited the granting of titles of nobility. The absence was deliberate, and it was felt in the drawing rooms of the Gilded Age as a specific kind of lack. Across the Atlantic, there was a social currency that outranked everything the Astors and the Vanderbilts and all their drawing rooms could produce. It was older than money. It was older than the United States. It came with coats of arms and seats in Parliament, and names that appeared in documents signed before the founding of the Republic, across which these women had spread their magnificent ambitions. A title, a real one. Duke, Marquess, Earl, Viscount, Baron. Each of these was, in the social calculus of the Victorian era, worth more than all the railroad stock in North America. Because the railroad stock could go, the title, barring some spectacular disgrace, could not. The market that existed to satisfy this desire was extraordinary in its organization. By 1890, there was a publication called Titled Americans. It was exactly what the name suggested, a directory of American women who had married into European nobility, and, by implication, a catalogue of the European noblemen who remained available. Each entry listed the man's rank, his country seat, his estimated income, and, with the frank pragmatism that characterized the era's approach to matrimony, his known debts. It was consulted in Fifth Avenue drawing rooms with the same cold pragmatism that their husbands applied to railroad prospectuses. A duke in need of capital, a baron with a crumbling estate, a viscount whose agricultural rents had been falling for 15 years. These were not warnings. In the logic of the marriage market, they were opportunities. The collision that produced this market was economic on both sides of the Atlantic. In America, the problem was a surplus of wealth and a deficit of social legitimacy. The decades following the Civil War had produced the greatest concentration of private wealth in human history. By 1890, there were over 4,000 millionaires in the United States. Their combined fortune exceeded the entire national budget. But in a country without an aristocracy, without hereditary rank, without the formal machinery of social distinction that Europe had been building for centuries, money without genealogy was money without meaning, at least in the circles where meaning was most carefully maintained. In Britain, the problem was the mirror image. The great agricultural estates that had sustained the landed aristocracy for centuries were failing. Cheap grain from America and Australia had flooded the market after the 1870s. Land rents that had once seemed as permanent as geography collapsed. By 1880, the Duke of Marlborough's estate at Blenheim Palace was losing money every year. The Duke of Manchester was mortgaging his family seat. Dozens of lesser lords were selling off paintings, silver and acreage just to keep their ancient roofs from falling in. The aristocracy had something America could not create. They had titles, lineage, and the social recognition of the oldest courts in Europe. America had something the aristocracy desperately needed: cash. The transatlantic marriage market was born from this mutual desperation, and it operated with the efficiency of any well-organized exchange. The London social season became the marketplace. Each spring, American mothers transported their daughters across the Atlantic. They rented houses in Mayfair. They hired social secretaries who knew which doors could be opened and which required a heavier toll. They paid fees to be presented at the court of St. James, where the Queen herself would receive a curtsy from a girl whose grandfather had been a ferryman or a fur trader. A single court presentation could cost thousands of dollars when you added the gown, the ostrich plumes, the precisely measured train, and the social obligations that followed in its wake. The return on this investment, if everything went according to plan, was a title, and a title, in the world these women were navigating, was everything. Between 1870 and 1914, 454 American women married titled Europeans. Their combined dowries and settlements exceeded $4 billion in modern value. By 1905, more than a third of the House of Lords had American connections through marriage. 9 American women held the rank of duchess, 33 were countesses, 46 were wives of baronets. The scale of this transfer, of money from the New World to the Old, of titles from the Old World to the New, was something no economist had predicted and no satirist could quite exaggerate. These numbers, recited calmly in a warm room with the evening quiet outside, take on a different quality than they have in the history books. They are not the statistics of commerce. They are the biographies of daughters. Each one of those 454 women was someone's child, someone who had grown up in a house full of noise and ambition, and her mother's calculating love. Each one had a name and a face and a set of feelings about what she wanted from her life that were usually in the machinery of the market completely beside the point. The market did not run on feelings. It ran on capital and genealogy, and the cold efficiency of matching what one side needed to what the other side had. And yet, woven through the whole magnificent arrangement, there was something else, something harder to name, a desire, not for titles exactly, but for what titles represented, the permission to be taken seriously, to walk into a room and have the room reorganize itself around your presence, to exist in the world not as the daughter of a man who had made too much money too recently, but as a woman who had, by whatever means necessary, earned the right to be considered permanent. It was a desire shaped by the specific constraints of the era. These women could not vote. In most states, they could not own property independent of their husbands. They could not practice law or medicine or stand for political office. The spheres available to them were social spheres, and in those spheres, the rules were written entirely by other women who had already secured their positions and had every reason to maintain the walls that kept newcomers out. In a world that offered women almost no formal power, the informal power of social rank was not a frivolity. It was the only game available, and the mothers of the Gilded Age were playing it with everything they had. Newport was the summer stage for all of this. The resort on the Rhode Island coast had been transformed, by the 1870s and 1880s, into the most visible arena of the new money competition, the place where the ambitions of Fifth Avenue were translated into marble and limestone, and the kind of hospitality that required weeks to plan and an army of servants to execute. The cottages, as they were called with a straight face by the people who owned them, were palaces by any reasonable definition. The breakers had 70 rooms. Marble House contained a ballroom finished in gold leaf. Each was a statement in stone about the specific ambitions of its owner, arranged along Bellevue Avenue like the chapters of a book whose theme was more money than anyone knows what to do with. The Newport summer season was, in miniature, the London social season, a compressed period of intense social activity in which the right attendance at the right events could advance a family's position by a decade. Daughters were presented, matches were made or advanced or quietly dropped. The intelligence networks that kept the hostesses informed of every development were as sophisticated, in their way, as anything the diplomats employed, a system of calls and letters and careful observation that tracked every arrival, every relationship, every subtle shift in standing, and transmitted the information through the drawing rooms at a speed that would have impressed the telegraph. Let the room settle around you now, let the gaslight dim slightly at the edges. There is a particular hour in a very large house when the servants have finished their last duties and the family is not yet asleep, when the house itself seems to breathe, slowly, between one thing and the next. This story lives in that hour, in the space between what was real and what was claimed to be real, between the name a woman was given and the name she chose for herself, between the world as it was and the world she was willing to build or borrow or buy. Sleep if you can lightly, there is more to tell. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. There is a book that should not have existed, and yet it ran to several editions. It was called Titled Americans, first published in 1890, and it listed, with the clinical precision of a livestock register, the American women who had married into European nobility. Its companion purpose, understood by every woman who purchased it from the bookshops on Fifth Avenue, was to catalogue what remained available, which unmarried noblemen held which titles, what their estates consisted of, what their annual incomes were approximately, and most critically for the mothers who consulted it with quiet intensity in their drawing rooms, what their debts amounted to. The debt column was not a deterrent. In the social arithmetic of the marriage market, it was the column that made the whole thing make sense. A nobleman without debt had no particular need of an American fortune. A nobleman drowning in debt, in mortgages on his ancestral acres, in bills from his London tailor, in the accumulated obligations of generations of men who had never been required to work, was a nobleman who was motivated, whose family solicitors had already done the math, whose mother, in a different drawing room in a different country, was consulting her own version of the same calculation. The symmetry was almost elegant. On one side of the Atlantic, American mothers with daughters to place were looking for the highest rank available within their financial reach. On the other side, English mothers with sons to marry off were looking for the largest fortune available within their social reach. Both sides had agents. Both sides had networks. Both sides understood that this was a transaction, and that the decorative overlay of romance that the newspapers would print, the love at first sight, the whirlwind courtship, the fairy tale match, was a convention rather than a description. The convention was maintained because it was easier on everyone. The reality was maintained in ledgers. The London social season in this context was not a social event. It was a commercial fair. It ran from May to the end of July, and during those months Mayfair and Belgravia filled with American families who had crossed the Atlantic specifically for this purpose. They rented houses on the most respectable streets. They employed social secretaries whose job was to navigate the intricate machinery of presentation and introduction. They arranged to be present at exactly the right events, the garden parties, the race meetings at Ascot, the balls at houses grand enough that an appearance there constituted a credential. And they brought their daughters, dressed by French couturiers, educated by governesses who had taught them the histories of every major noble family in the British Isles, and trained since childhood to perform a version of themselves that was simultaneously American enough to be interesting and refined enough to be acceptable. The mothers were the architects of all of this. The daughters were, in the most polite possible sense, the merchandise. This is not cruelty applied retrospectively. Many of the mothers said it themselves, in letters and diaries, with a directness that is startling only because we have forgotten how openly the era conducted its transactions. A good match for a daughter was a mother's life work. The years of education, presentation, and strategic positioning all pointed toward a single moment, the engagement announcement, that would justify the investment and secure the family's position for a generation. The man in question did not need to be lovable. He needed to be titled, and he needed to be willing, and those two qualifications, combined with the right dowry, were sufficient. Love, if it arrived later, was a bonus. If it did not arrive, it was not missed, because no one had put it in the contract. Consider what it meant to be presented at court. For an American girl, the presentation at the court of St. James was the credential that opened everything else. Without it, you were merely a rich American, which was interesting but not officially recognized. With it, you had been received by the Queen herself. You had worn the regulation 3 feather plumes in your hair. You had executed a curtsy, the deep, controlled, backward-gliding curtsy that required months of practice to perform without wobbling, while the most powerful monarch in the world acknowledged your existence with a brief nod, and that nod was worth more in the social mathematics of the era than any number of Newport cottages. The preparation for a court presentation was, in itself, a substantial undertaking. The gown had to meet precise specifications. The train had to be exactly the right length, neither too short, which would look careless, nor too long, which would look presumptuous. The feathers had to be positioned at exactly the correct angle. The gloves had to be the correct shade. The carriage that brought you had to be the correct kind. Every detail was regulated because the regulation was the point. It sorted those who had learned the rules from those who hadn't, and in doing so performed the essential aristocratic function of distinguishing insiders from outsiders. An American girl who got all of this right was not just well dressed. She was demonstrating that she had absorbed the code, that she had, through money and effort and intelligence, made herself legible to a system that had not been designed with her in mind. The English aristocracy respected this. They respected it in the way that any entrenched establishment respects someone who has taken the trouble to learn the rules before trying to change them, with a guarded admiration that was never quite warm but was at least genuine. The costs accumulated at every stage. The gown, several $100s, minimum. The plumes, sourced from specific suppliers, at specific prices. The social secretary, a retainer paid monthly, for a season that lasted 3 months. The house in Mayfair, rented at London prices, which in the 1890s were not modest. The carriage and horses, if you didn't arrive with your own, hired from the most respectable establishment available, because arriving in something inadequate was worse than arriving late. The flowers, the dinners, the incidental expenses of maintaining a social campaign on foreign territory for an entire summer, figures that climbed, when honestly totaled, into the tens of thousands of dollars for a single season. And all of this was preliminary. The season itself was the investment, the engagement was the return. A daughter who returned from London as the betrothed of an earl had generated, in the logic of the market, a return that justified every penny. A daughter who returned from London with pleasant memories and no ring had consumed a season's budget with nothing to show for it. The mothers counted very carefully. Some hired professional investigators to research the finances and reputations of the men their daughters were meeting. Some commissioned genealogical studies to verify that the titles in question were what their holders claimed them to be. The market had its own forms of due diligence. The men who came to America, and many of them did, crossing in the other direction, arriving in New York or Newport with their titles and their charm and their quietly urgent need for capital, were operating by a different set of rules, but toward the same end. An English nobleman visiting America in the 1880s was treated with a deference that bore no relationship to his actual character. Doors opened, invitations multiplied. Women who would not have spoken to an American of equivalent manners and conversation found themselves extending courtesies to a viscount or an earl that had nothing to do with him personally and everything to do with what he represented. The Duke of Manchester, the ninth, who would eventually marry Helena Zimmermann, was reportedly capable of entering a New York drawing room and having the entire room rearrange itself to face him, simply on the strength of his rank. There was no magic in this. It was pure social convention, operating on the same principle as every other convention. It worked because everyone agreed to act as if it were true. The Duke's ancestors had held his title for centuries. This fact, communicated by the title itself, placed him in a category that no American family could enter, no matter how many millions they accumulated. The category was not wealth. It was permanence. Permanence was the thing the Gilded Age new money families could not buy outright. They could buy houses that looked as though they had always been there. They could fill them with furniture and art that had actually always been somewhere European, somewhere ancient, somewhere that carried the patina of old decision and old care. They could educate their children in ways indistinguishable from the education of old money children. They could learn the correct way to address an invitation, the correct fork for the fish course, the correct tone of voice for dismissing a servant. All of this they could acquire, but they could not acquire the genealogy that said their family had been doing these things for generations, and that their rank was recognized not just by the people in this room, but by the machinery of the state itself. A title did that. A title said, "This family is not merely wealthy, it is recognized." It appears in a document that the government itself maintains. It carries obligations and privileges that cannot be purchased and cannot be revoked, except by disgrace so spectacular that it becomes a different kind of permanent. For the mothers who were doing this calculation in the 1880s and 1890s, the appeal was not snobbery. It was, in a world that offered women almost no formal security, the closest thing available to a guarantee. The guarantee had costs that the catalogue did not list. The column for annual income did not mention what it felt like to live in a house where the wind came in under the doors in January, and the fires heated only the room they were burning in. The column for estate acreage did not mention that the estate had not been properly maintained in 40 years, and that the American bride would be expected to fund its restoration with her dowry money, while her husband spent the interest on horses and club memberships. The column for social position did not mention that the position came with obligations, of hospitality, of charity, of endless performative duty, that would consume most of a year and all of a woman's privacy. These were the things that the daughters who had read the catalogue from their mother's laps discovered only after the contracts were signed. The catalogue listed what was on offer. It did not describe what was offered in exchange. That part of the transaction was conducted in a different language, the language of expectation and convention, and the unspoken rules of a household that had been running on the same principles since before the bride's grandparents were born. The letters of introduction that accompanied the daughters across the Atlantic were the keys to the whole enterprise. A letter from a woman already established in London society, vouching for the American girl's family and connections, was worth more than any amount of money in terms of the doors it opened. These letters were negotiated with the same care that business contracts were negotiated. A mother who wanted her daughter properly introduced would spend months cultivating the right relationships, performing the right social services, ensuring that when the time came and the letter was requested, it could not reasonably be refused. The social economy ran on obligation. Every favour performed was a promissory note. Every introduction given was an investment in the creditor's account. Still, the catalogue was consulted, the season was attended, the introductions were made, and the letters came back across the Atlantic, breathless, carefully edited, mentioning the gardens at some estate in Wiltshire, or the shooting at a house party in Scotland, or the remarkable clarity of a particular evening at the opera, when a young man with excellent manners and a family seat that dated to the 13th century had leaned over to offer his programme and, in doing so, changed the direction of an American woman's life. The mothers read these letters carefully. They read between the lines. They noted which adjectives appeared and which were conspicuously absent. They wrote back with advice that was practical and unsentimental, and expressed, always, in the warmest possible terms. They were not heartless. They loved their daughters with the specific strategic love of women who had learned that love without planning was a luxury that daughters could not afford. They had made their calculations, they had done their research, and they were waiting, with a patience that looked like serenity and felt like pressure, for the right answer to arrive. The French market ran in parallel with the British one, and in some ways it was even more complicated. France had been a republic since 1870, which meant that its aristocracy had been formally stripped of political power. No House of Lords, no hereditary seats, no legislative function attached to the title. The French nobility existed as a social fact without an institutional role, which made its titles simultaneously more available, because the government no longer controlled access to them and less legible, because there was no single registry, no definitive list, and the claims to various ancient titles were often disputed, obscure, or genuinely impossible to verify. This made France both an attractive market for American women seeking titles and a somewhat treacherous one. A French count or marquis might be exactly what he represented, the holder of a title with genuine historical roots in the French aristocracy. He might also be the holder of a title whose historical roots were somewhat creatively documented, or whose family had adopted the title in circumstances that a strict genealogist would have found questionable. In the drawing rooms of Paris, the question was not often asked. The title was used, the social position was claimed, and no one with an interest in maintaining the generally pleasant atmosphere of French high society had any particular reason to initiate an investigation. Let the catalogue close now. Let it rest on the table in the lamplight. The lists are long, and the names are many, and somewhere in those columns, a life is being determined by a figure in a ledger that the woman who will live that life has never seen. The room is warm, the fire is low. Outside, the street is quiet, and the carriages have stopped passing for the night. Rest now. The market will be open again in the morning. The newspapers that covered the transatlantic marriages were not neutral observers of the market. They were participants in it, and their participation shaped the terms of the transaction in ways that neither the mothers who read them nor the daughters who were described in them fully understood. The social pages of the New York Times and the Herald and Town Topics provided a continuous feed of information about who was being received, who was being presented, and who had made, or was in the process of making, the kind of match that would be read about over breakfast by the thousands of families who aspired to something similar. Town Topics, in particular, was a peculiar institution. It was a society gossip sheet that had developed by the 1890s into something more powerful and more sinister than its title suggested. Its editor, Colonel William Dalton Mann, had a talent for obtaining embarrassing information about the great families of New York and Newport, and using that information, alternately, as material for entertainment and as leverage for what can only be described as social blackmail. He would offer to suppress damaging items for the right consideration. He collected testimonials from grateful subjects alongside the evidence he had gathered about ungrateful ones. The existence of this publication and the anxiety it generated in the drawing rooms it covered reveals something important about the nature of Gilded Age social identity. It was held in place, in part, by fear. Fear of exposure, fear of the item in the gossip column that would confirm what the polite world was already whispering, fear that the carefully constructed identity, maintained through years of investment and performance, would be unravelled by a single paragraph in a publication that circulated through every drawing room in the city. This fear was not irrational. Social identities, once destabilised by exposure, rarely recovered fully. The woman who had been identified in print as new money pretending to old, or as having connections less distinguished than she claimed, or as having had a past less suitable than she presented, could manage the damage with money and time and the strategic deployment of social allies. But she could not erase the item, and the item would circulate for years, retrieved by anyone with an interest in retrieving it. The permanence of print was, in the era before the internet, already something to be feared by people whose identities depended on the continuous management of what was known about them. The mothers who were running their social campaigns through the Atlantic crossing understood this. They managed their public profiles with the same careful attention they gave to everything else, ensuring that the items that appeared were the items they had generated, that the descriptions were the descriptions they had provided, and that the narrative of the match they were making was the narrative they had written, rather than the narrative that someone else had assembled from the available evidence. This was not merely vanity, it was a survival skill in a world where the stories told about you were, in a very practical sense, who you were. Not everyone went through the catalogue. Not everyone had the patience for a season in Mayfair, or the capital for a proper dowry, or the genealogy that made a daughter a viable candidate for the kind of match the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue most admired. Some women, faced with a social ceiling and no obvious route through it, found a different kind of door. They found it not in the marriage market, but in the much older and more dangerous market of invention. They did not buy a title by marrying into one. They manufactured one from materials that were, at various points, mostly air. To understand how this was possible, you have to understand the particular vulnerability of the Gilded Age social world to a certain kind of performance. The rules of this world were elaborate and specific. The correct fork, the correct dress, the correct mode of address, but the enforcement of these rules depended entirely on everyone's willingness to maintain them. Old money knew old money by 1,000 signals that were almost impossible to fake and almost impossible to explain. But new money could be fooled, at least for a while, by someone who had studied the signals carefully and reproduced them with sufficient conviction. The drawing rooms of Newport and Fifth Avenue were, in this sense, both the most demanding and the most gullible audiences in the world. Demanding because the standards were extraordinarily high and the scrutiny was constant. Gullible because the desire to believe that one had attracted the right sort of person was so strong that it overwhelmed caution. A woman who arrived at a Newport house party with the right letters of introduction, the right accent, the right dress, and the right casual reference to her family's estates in the appropriate European country could, with luck and nerve, maintain the fiction long enough to become established. And once established, the fiction had a way of becoming, in all practical respects, as solid as the truth. Consider what establishment meant. In the social world of the 1880s and 1890s, your identity was largely a matter of what other people agreed to say about you. There was no identity card. There was no centralised registry of who had which title, accessible to hostesses on Fifth Avenue or in Newport. There was the social register, which was essentially a list of people who had already been agreed upon. There were letters of introduction, which were only as reliable as the person who signed them. And there was gossip, which moved quickly and could undo everything, but which also, in the right conditions, could build everything it had previously torn down. A woman who wanted to present herself as something other than what she was needed 3 things: a story that was specific enough to seem real, connections that were too far away to be easily checked, and the kind of social confidence that registered as authenticity rather than performance. The story had to have texture. It had to include names, places, dates, not so many as to seem rehearsed, but enough to give it the weight of lived experience. The connections had to be genuine enough to produce a letter or two on correct stationery, but situated in a context: an estate in Ireland, a chateau in the Loire Valley, a family seat in some remote corner of Moravia, where the American hostess receiving the introduction had no way of verifying the details, and the confidence had to be absolute. Any hesitation, any flicker of uncertainty in the eyes at a direct question, any slight inconsistency in the story across 2 tellings could begin the process of unravelling. There were women in this era who possessed all 3 of these qualities in extraordinary abundance. One of the most extraordinary was a French peasant's daughter, from the south of France who, through a combination of imagination, nerve, and a relationship to the truth that was genuinely creative rather than merely dishonest, managed to sustain a fiction for more than 2 decades that fooled not just drawing rooms but banks, law courts, and the highest levels of French government. Her name was Thérèse Humbert, and she was born in 1856 in a village in the Midi-Pyrénées. Her father was a foundling who claimed, without much evidence, to be the hidden son of a noblewoman. The family was poor in the way that only people with grand pretensions can be poor, suffused with the dignity of imagined origins, maintaining the fiction of gentle birth against the obvious evidence of ordinary circumstances. Thérèse absorbed this from childhood. She understood, before she could have articulated it, that what you claimed to be was, in many respects, more powerful than what you were. As a child, she had already demonstrated the particular genius that would define her adult life. She convinced her friends to pool their jewellery so that she could pretend to be wealthy. Not wealthy herself, wealthy through the accumulation of other people's contributions, which she organised and directed and wore with such conviction that the impression of wealth became, for the duration of the performance, indistinguishable from the real thing. This was not petty theft. It was, in embryonic form, the method she would use for the next 60 years, borrowing reality from those who had it, using it to generate the impression of something grander, and returning it, or not, depending on what the circumstances required. The story she eventually built her fortune on began on a train, as stories with good dramatic structure often do. In 1879, Thérèse was travelling when she heard sounds of distress from a neighbouring compartment. She entered, through the window, climbing along the outside of the moving train, which gives you some sense of the woman's physical confidence as well as her narrative instincts, and found a man in the grip of a heart attack. She produced her smelling salts, the man recovered, and he introduced himself as Robert Henry Crawford, an American millionaire who told her he was eternally grateful and would see that she was rewarded. Robert Henry Crawford did not exist. He had never existed. He was a character that Thérèse invented, and she populated him with the specificity of a novelist who has spent years living with her creation. He had brothers, whose roles in his will she detailed with precise and consistent care. He had a fortune, sealed in a safe that could not be opened until the legal dispute over its contents was resolved. He had, in other words, the essential quality of any successful fiction. He was never quite present, always just off stage, his existence permanently deferred to a moment that never quite arrived. Using this invisible American millionaire as collateral, which is to say using a story as collateral, Thérèse borrowed. She borrowed from bankers who were dazzled by the scale of the inheritance she would eventually receive. She borrowed from private investors who saw in the Crawford fortune a return too large to decline. She borrowed from the Bank of France, from a Crédit Industriel, from scores of individuals ranging from the very wealthy to the working class, each of whom believed that the safe in the Humbert house on the Avenue de la Grande Armée contained enough securities to pay everyone back many times over. The Humbert house on the Avenue de la Grande Armée became one of the great salons of Paris. To Madame's dinners came statesmen, jurists, artists, literati. The finance ministers attended, the aristocracy attended, the emperor's son attended. Thérèse moved through her own drawing room with the ease of a woman who had always been exactly where she was, who had, in some fundamental sense, been born to this, rather than arrived at it through 20 years of careful, sustained, exhausting deception. The safe was there. It sat in a room on an upper floor. It could not be opened, she explained, because of the ongoing litigation. The nephews of Robert Henry Crawford, her brothers, in fact, playing the roles she had assigned them, were contesting the will. Until the courts resolved the matter, the inheritance was locked away. But it was there. Anyone could see the safe. Anyone could see the house, the servants, the carriages, the jewellery, the dinners, the guests. The evidence of wealth was everywhere, only its source was behind a closed door. For 20 years this worked. 20 years of Parisian salons, of political dinners, of borrowed credibility cascading outward from a locked safe that contained, when it was finally opened in 1902, a brick, some buttons, and an Italian lira note. The explosion when the fraud collapsed was of a scale proportionate to the scale of the deception. The victims included the Empress Eugénie, the son of the President of the Republic, and hundreds of smaller investors who had trusted in a fortune that had never existed. The total losses exceeded 100 million francs. Thérèse was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. She served it, and then she disappeared. What the Humbert affair illuminated was something that the more legitimate marriage market of the Gilded Age had been operating on all along: the fundamental role of belief in the creation of social reality. A title was worth what people agreed it was worth. A fortune was real when the behaviour it generated, the houses, the servants, the invitations, the deference, was indistinguishable from the behaviour of a genuine fortune. The safe did not need to contain the promised securities. It needed only to seem as though it might. The gap between seeming and being in social terms was much smaller than it appeared, and in that gap certain kinds of women made their lives. The Humbert case was the extreme version of a practice that ran through the entire social world of the late 19th century at every level of intensity. There were women who falsely claimed noble ancestry in European countries where the distinction was difficult for American hostesses to verify. There were women who adopted courtesy titles to which they had no genuine claim, calling themselves countess or duchess, based on a connection to a minor noble family so distant it was, legally and genealogically, meaningless. There were women who commissioned coats of arms from heraldic painters in London and displayed them on their carriages and their stationery, with the implication that the arms were inherited rather than invented. There were women, more audaciously, who invented entire families, who claimed descent from Irish earls whose lines had conveniently died out in the 16th century, leaving no living relatives to dispute the claim, who presented themselves in London drawing rooms as having connections to noble houses in Poland or Hungary or Bohemia, places far enough from England and America that the social secretaries who might have checked these claims had no reliable way of doing so. The Austro-Hungarian Empire in particular had such a complicated internal structure of nobility, archduchesses and barons and Freiherren and Ritters at varying levels of the system, that a claim to a minor Austrian title could be almost impossible to investigate. One of the more remarkable instances of this kind of invention involved a New York socialite who presented herself, in the early years of the 20th century, as the daughter of Rudolf, Crown Prince of Austria, and his mistress the Baroness Wetzera. Rudolf and the Baroness had died together in the famous Meierling incident of 1889, one of the most dramatic and disputed events of the late Victorian era, and the circumstances of their deaths, a suicide pact, or a murder, or some combination of the two, had generated enough mystery and enough public fascination that a claim of descent from them was both inherently dramatic and essentially impossible to disprove. Alma Wetzera Hain, who was born in New York in 1890, the year after Meierling, presented herself as the secret daughter of this union, raised in obscurity to protect her from the political consequences of her parentage. She called herself Princess Wetzera of Austria. She claimed her son was heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. She maintained this fiction with the complete commitment of someone who had, at some point, decided to simply be the person she claimed to be rather than the person she was. She moved in social circles. She was received. She died, still performing the role, in 1919. What strikes you in reading these stories at a quiet distance of more than a century is not the fraud itself but the energy required to sustain it. The constant vigilance, the careful management of every conversation, every letter, every introduction, the need to ensure that no two people in the same room had separately asked questions that might, when compared, produce an inconsistency. The burden of being, at all times, sufficiently the person you claim to be that no one thought to look more closely. And alongside that burden, the exhilaration, which the records read between the lines make unmistakable. There was something in these performances, in the successful execution of a role that the world had decided you had no right to play, that produced a satisfaction unavailable by legitimate means. Not because deception is inherently pleasurable, but because the deception was, in every case, a response to a world that had placed limits on what these women were permitted to be. The limits were real, the anger they generated was real, and the creativity with which certain women responded to them was, in its own way, real too. The room has grown quieter. The fire needs no more tending. Outside, the street has been still for a long time, and the sounds of the house have settled into the deep, slow rhythm of a place at rest. Let your own breath slow to match it. The mechanics of this kind of performance were well understood by a small but distinct category of Gilded Age women who moved between the legitimate and illegitimate ends of the social spectrum with a fluency that the drawing rooms found difficult to categorize. They were not quite fraudsters in the criminal sense. They were not, for the most part, stealing money. They were stealing something more intangible, the social credit that attached to birth and title and the patina of old connection. Whether that was, strictly speaking, theft was a question the era preferred not to examine too closely. The woman who was most skilled at this kind of navigation was the woman who understood that social reality in the Gilded Age was constructed rather than given, that it was built, maintained, and policed by the collective behaviour of the people who inhabited it, rather than inscribed anywhere permanent. The rules were real, but they were enforced by people rather than by institutions, and people could be persuaded, flattered, distracted, and managed. A woman with the right combination of intelligence and nerve could walk into a room as one thing and leave it, if everything went well, as something considerably better. The specific vulnerability of new money society to this kind of manipulation was a function of its own anxiety. The new money families of Newport and Fifth Avenue were themselves performing an identity they had not quite inherited. They were learning, through expensive trial and error, how to behave like people who had always had money. This learning process made them, paradoxically, both more rule-conscious and more susceptible to confident performance. They were alert to violations of the code because they were themselves still learning the code, but they were also, underneath the alertness, hungry for validation from anyone who seemed to know the code naturally and effortlessly. A woman who performed aristocratic ease with sufficient conviction was offering the new money families exactly what they wanted. Evidence that the life they were building had the right tone. If the Countess of wherever accepted an invitation, the invitation must have been worth accepting. If the visiting Russian princess attended a dinner, the dinner must have been at the right level. The fraudster's gift to the hostess was not the fraudster's presence. It was the legitimacy that the presence conferred. This is why the unmasking of such women, when it happened, when the questions multiplied past the point where confident assertion could deflect them, was typically followed not by the straightforward condemnation that one might expect, but by a period of complicated social negotiation. The hostesses who had received the impostor had their own reputations to manage. The guests who had attended her dinners had their own social credit tied up in the events. The whole network of social obligation and mutual endorsement that the Gilded Age ran on was implicated in the exposure, and the response tended to be a managed retreat rather than a full-throated repudiation. There is something in this that is almost generous, almost forgiving of the human desire to be more than one was born. Almost. The actual exposure of a woman who had been presenting herself as something she was not was rarely gentle. The drawing rooms that had been most enthusiastically deceived were generally the most enthusiastically offended, and the machinery of social destruction that they could deploy was considerably more efficient than the machinery of social construction that had allowed the fiction to flourish in the first place. The same letters of introduction that could build a reputation in a season could destroy one in an afternoon. The case of Alma Vetsera Hain is worth dwelling on, because it represents a specific and remarkable variety of social imposture. The Meyerling incident of 1889, in which Rudolf, Crown Prince of Austria, and the 17-year-old Baroness Mary Vetsera died together in what was officially described as a suicide pact, was one of the most dramatic and obscure events of the late Victorian era. The official Austrian account was clearly incomplete. The actual circumstances were disputed, suppressed, and speculated about for decades. Into this ambiguity, Alma Vetsera Hain inserted herself. She claimed to be the secret child of this union, born after the deaths at Meyerling, raised in obscurity to protect her from the political consequences of her parentage. The claim had two qualities that made it almost impossible to disprove. It was just specific enough to seem credible, and it pointed to events that the Austro-Hungarian government had every reason to keep obscure. Anyone who asked questions was running into a wall of official silence that had nothing to do with Alma's invention and everything to do with the genuine imperial effort to suppress the truth of what had happened at Meyerling. She moved through New York society in the early years of the 20th century with the quiet confidence of someone who has decided who they are and does not feel the need to argue about it. She married. She had a son whom she described as heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. She maintained the performance until 1919, through the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself, through the end of the world that would have had any institutional stake in her claim, and died that year after attending a victory ball having taken poison. The reasons are not entirely clear. The person who emerged from the performance at the end may not have been entirely clear to herself. What is clear is the specific kind of loneliness that sustained impostures produced. The woman who has been performing an identity for 20 years has also, in the performance, been protecting a truth about herself that she cannot share with anyone who knows her as the person she claims to be. There is no one to tell. The performance requires the absence of the performer, and the person inside the performance is alone in a way that the social world around her, however full, cannot alleviate. This loneliness is different from the loneliness of the dollar princesses in their cold palaces. The dollar princesses were lonely because they had been removed from their world and placed in one that treated them as instruments. The impostors were lonely because they had removed themselves, had elected at some earlier moment to become someone else, and the distance between who they were and who they claimed to be was a space that no social connection could bridge, because the connection was always being made with the performance rather than the performer. A convincing social identity in the world of the Gilded Age was built the way a well-appointed room is built, from the outside in. You began with the surfaces, the dress, the carriage, the house. You layered in the furnishings, the correct opinions, the appropriate references, the names dropped at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right casualness. You added the details that registered as authenticity without announcing themselves, the particular way you addressed a footman, or corrected a mispronunciation, or laughed at a drawing room joke that required a knowledge of the people involved. And finally, somewhere at the centre of all of this, in the deepest and most private room, you maintained whatever truth about yourself you had not yet replaced with something better. The women who were best at this were not necessarily the most dishonest. They were the most perceptive. They had studied the room. They had learned its rules not from manuals but from observation. The long, patient, unblinking observation of someone who has always known they would eventually have to perform what others performed naturally. The natural inhabitants of these rooms never quite noticed the study. They were too comfortable to be watchful. Comfort in any social system breeds a specific kind of carelessness, the carelessness of someone who's never had reason to look twice. The architecture of a successful deception had several load-bearing elements, and the most important of them was time. The longer a fiction survived, the more structural integrity it acquired. Each season it persisted added another layer. Each person who accepted it and acted accordingly became, in a sense, a guarantor of its authenticity. If the Countess of X had been received at 3 consecutive Newport seasons, and if Mrs. Astor herself had included her on a guest list, then the question of whether the Countess was genuinely a Countess became not a factual question but a social one, and social questions were answered by consensus rather than by investigation. This was the essential genius of the most successful performers in this world. They understood that authenticity was not a fixed quality, but a social agreement. It was produced and maintained by the behaviour of everyone in the room, not just by the credentials of the person whose identity was in question. A woman who behaved like a countess, who was treated like a countess, who appeared on the same guest lists as acknowledged countesses, and moved through the same rooms with the same ease, was, for all practical social purposes, a countess. The title was real because the treatment was real. The treatment was real because everyone in the room had implicitly agreed to extend it. The letters of introduction were the hinge of the whole mechanism. In a world without identity documents, without photographs in official records, without any of the verification infrastructure that later centuries would take for granted, a letter of introduction was the primary credential. It was a piece of paper on which a person already known to the community vouched for a person not yet known. It transferred credibility from the established to the new, and it carried with it the implicit obligation of the vouching party. If the person introduced turned out to be other than represented, some portion of the embarrassment fell back on the introducer. This obligation was taken seriously, and it was the main reason the system worked as well as it did. Most introductions were genuine. Most people vouched for were exactly what they appeared to be. But the system's reliance on the integrity of the vouching party was also its vulnerability. A forged letter on correct stationery bearing a recognizable signature could open the same doors as a genuine one. A real letter from a genuine person who had themselves been deceived about the nature of the person they were introducing could do the same. The chain of credibility extended only as far as the honesty of its least honest link. Consider the mechanics of a court presentation. The procedure for presenting a debutante at the court of St. James required, among other things, that she be presented by someone who had herself been presented. The chain of legitimate presentation was supposed to be unbroken, each woman vouched for by someone already in the system, going back, in theory, to women who had been presented since the inception of the ceremony. In practice, the Lord Chamberlain's office, which managed the presentations, was receiving hundreds of applications each season from women whose credentials were verified by references who were, in turn, verified by their own references, the whole chain lengthening until the point of origin was too far back to examine. Women who had been presented sometimes sold their status as presenters. Not openly, not for money, that would have been unacceptably vulgar, but the social economy of favours and obligations that governed Gilded Age life was entirely capable of converting a presentation, which was technically a social courtesy, into a transaction that benefited both parties. A woman with genuine court access who needed something, a favour, a connection, an introduction of her own, might find that her willingness to present a particular American girl was extremely useful currency. The American girl's mother, meanwhile, was prepared to pay, not in money, but in the equivalent, in invitations, in social endorsements, in the careful direction of other social resources toward the needs of the woman who had given them this crucial access. The transaction was real, even if its nature was never explicitly acknowledged. Both parties understood what was being exchanged. Both parties maintained the fiction that they were simply friends, doing as friends do. This was the currency of Gilded Age social life, obligation, deferred and accumulated and deployed with the precision of a financial instrument. Some of the women navigating this world were not deceiving anyone about their identity. They were, instead, operating at the edge of what their legitimate identity could plausibly claim. A family with a genuine but minor connection to European nobility could, without technically lying, present that connection in terms that suggested rather more than it was. A grandmother who had married a third son of a minor Irish baronet could become, in the retelling, a connection to the Irish nobility. The connection was real, its presentation was strategic. The gap between the two was the space in which social identity was constructed. The dress was part of this architecture, and its role was more than decorative. In an era before photography was widely reproduced, before the mass media of images that would later make a woman's appearance in a drawing room a public event, what you wore told the room almost everything it needed to know about where you had come from and what you were claiming. A dress from Worth in Paris, the premier couturier of the second half of the 19th century, was not just clothing. It was a credential. It said, whoever is wearing this has either the money or the connections to have ordered it from the source. It registered as a kind of truthful document because the cost of lying, of wearing a Worth copy rather than a Worth original, was the very real risk of being identified as someone who had done so. The truly wealthy, by the 1880s, had developed an eye for these distinctions that was almost supernatural in its sensitivity. They could identify the cut of a bodice as Parisian or provincial. They could read the quality of the silk in a glance. They could assess the finishing of a glove, the dressing of a hat, the particular way a woman moved in clothes she was used to wearing versus clothes she had put on for the occasion. These readings were conducted continuously and unconsciously, as a constant background process. The way a musician in a well-trained orchestra hears not just the notes being played, but the quality of the playing, the pressure, the timing, the ease or effort behind the sound. A woman performing an identity she had not been born to was performing in front of this audience. She had to get all of it right. The dress, the movement, the voice, the references, the reactions. She had to get it right not once, but consistently, across multiple appearances, in different contexts, in front of different audiences, over a period of months or years. She had to get it right even when she was tired, even when someone asked a question she hadn't anticipated, even when the person she was talking to knew something she didn't know they knew. The ones who managed this longest were the ones who had internalized the performance so completely that it was no longer quite a performance. They had become what they claimed to be, or something close enough to it that the distinction was, for most practical purposes, irrelevant. They had lived the role long enough that they had genuine opinions about the food at Blenheim and the gardens at Chatsworth, and the best time of year to be in the south of France. Opinions formed not from actually having been to those places, but from having listened, over years, to the people who had until their knowledge was indistinguishable from experience. This is one of the stranger effects of sustained social performance. It produces a kind of expertise. The woman who has spent a decade pretending to be intimately familiar with the aristocratic world of England and France knows that world in some respects better than its actual inhabitants. The inhabitants don't need to think about it. They grew up inside it. It is simply the texture of their lives, no more remarkable to them than the weight of the air they breathe. The woman who has studied it from the outside, who has mapped its conventions and catalogued its codes and practiced its gestures in the privacy of her bedroom mirror, knows it with the particular precision of someone who has never been able to take it for granted. The Gilded Age drew people with this kind of knowledge to New York and Newport and London and Paris with the reliability of a tide. Every new season brought new arrivals, some legitimate, some not, many occupying the interesting middle territory, where the truth was exactly as ambiguous as the performer needed it to be. They circulated through the same drawing rooms, attended the same balls, appeared at the same race meetings and opera performances and country house weekends. They built networks of acquaintance that were, in some cases, more solid than the networks of the genuinely established, because they had worked harder to build them and understood their value more precisely. In this world, the woman who had successfully positioned herself, who had the right letters, the right dress, the right manner, the right story, occupied a position that was, for all social purposes, real. The title she claimed might or might not appear in any official registry, but if the right people in the right rooms were treating her as though she held it, then she held it in the only way that mattered in these rooms, socially. The social reality was the operative reality. The official reality was somewhere else, in documents that no one in this drawing room had any particular reason to examine. Let the drawing room recede now. Let the voices fade and the candlelight soften, and the whole elaborate edifice settle into something quieter and less demanding. Outside, the night is complete. The street lamps have dimmed to their lowest setting. The carriages have been put away. You are somewhere between waking and not waking. The story is still here. It does not require your full attention. Let it flow past you like water, carrying what it carries, depositing what it leaves, and moving on. The particular craft of the accomplished social impersonator was not, at its core, dishonesty. It was something more interesting, a sustained attention to the performed nature of all social identity. The genuine aristocrat and the woman-performing aristocracy were, in the end, both performing. The difference was that one had been practicing since birth and the other had started later. The late starter had to be more deliberate. The deliberateness, if visible, was fatal. If invisible, it was something close to an achievement. There were women in this world who took a middle path, who did not exactly fabricate identities, but who allowed the ambiguities of their actual backgrounds to expand in the direction of the more impressive interpretation. A grandmother who had once been received by a minor European nobleman became, in the retelling, a family connection to European nobility. A great-great-uncle who had been granted a courtesy title in one of the smaller German states in the early 19th century became, by the time the story reached Newport in 1890, a family with hereditary titles. The expansion was not lying exactly. It was selective editing applied to a complicated truth. The stationery was important in ways that seem excessive until you understand what it communicated. A woman's visiting card in the 1890s was a credential and a statement simultaneously. Its size, its typeface, the quality of the cardstock, the particular formulation of the name, Mrs., or the Honourable, or a hyphenated name that suggested 2 families' worth of social capital. All of these communicated the claimant's identity before she entered the room. A card with a European coat of arms engraved in the upper left corner was saying something specific about the family's history. A card without one was saying something else. The forgery of a coat of arms, or the commissioning of a new one from a heraldic artist and its subsequent presentation, as an inherited rather than invented emblem, was not technically illegal, and was much more common than the history books acknowledge. The Gilded Age heraldic business was, in fact, a significant industry. English firms in London and Exeter and Dublin were prepared, for the right fee, to research a family's genealogical connections and produce a coat of arms appropriate to those connections. The fee covered the research. It also covered a degree of interpretive generosity in the conclusions. A family with a genuine but tenuous claim to a medieval ancestor might find, after a thorough and expensive investigation, that their claim was somewhat more solid than they had expected. The coat of arms arrived on a beautifully printed certificate suitable for framing, and was subsequently engraved on the stationery, the silver, and the carriage panels of a family that had, 6 months ago, had no heraldic identity at all. This practice was so widespread that the legitimate heralds, the College of Arms in England, the Court of the Lord Lion in Scotland, spent a significant portion of their time and institutional energy distinguishing genuine grants and confirmations from the products of what one herald called the gentlemen of the engraving trade, who have no more right to grant arms than my bootmaker. The gentlemen of the engraving trade paid no attention to these complaints, because their clients paid considerably better than the heralds were empowered to fine them. In France, where the Republican government had formally abolished heraldic law, along with the aristocratic order it served, the trade in arms and titles operated with even fewer constraints. A French heraldic artist could produce a coat of arms for any family willing to pay for one, without any formal authority either permitting or prohibiting the transaction. The arms were created, they were used, they appeared on stationery and calling cards in the drawing rooms of Paris and soon enough Newport, and if anyone asked about their origins, the answer was that the family had always had them, which was in a narrow technical sense not quite a lie, since the family had indeed always had them for the past 6 months. The season of 1895 was by any standard remarkable. In that single year, 9 American heiresses married titled Europeans. The newspapers covered the engagements and the weddings with the comprehensive enthusiasm that they reserved for events that combined spectacle with social significance. Consuelo Vanderbilt and the Duke of Marlborough, Anna Gould and Count Bonny de Castellane, Mary Leiter and Lord Curzon. Each match was reported, analysed and compared with the others, as though the year's crop of transatlantic unions constituted a kind of social harvest, whose quality and quantity could be assessed and ranked. The women in these stories were not passive participants in the coverage. They understood, each in her own way, that the public performance of their marriages was part of the transaction. The bride's dress was a public document. The guest list was a social statement. The venue was chosen for its symbolic resonance as much as for its practical suitability. St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue, which hosted both the Vanderbilt Marlborough and Zimmerman Manchester weddings, was the church of New York's social establishment, its presence on a wedding invitation conferring a layer of institutional legitimacy on the match that would have been difficult to achieve elsewhere. The photographers who recorded these events were not merely documentarians. They were participants in the construction of the social record that would follow the bride across the Atlantic and, through the circulation of illustrated newspapers, around the world. A photograph of Consuelo Vanderbilt in her wedding gown, the white satin embroidered with silver and pearls, the Brussels lace veil, the orchid bouquet, was a photograph of a transaction whose terms would eventually be disclosed in a Vatican courtroom. But that was 30 years away. On the day itself, the photograph showed a beautiful girl in an extraordinary dress, and that was what the world saw. The gown told the story that everything else was being careful not to tell. It weighed enough that walking in it required practice. The train was 15 feet long, which meant that Consuelo moved through her own wedding preceded by the fabric of her compliance, a physical trail of the commitment she had not chosen but would be required to honour. She had described the steel brace her mother had made her wear through childhood as preparation. The gown was the final examination in that long curriculum, the test of whether all the preparation had produced the performance the occasion required. It had. The veil hid the tears, the photographs showed only the dress. The newspapers did not describe the tears. They described everything else with the comprehensive specificity of people who understood that their readers wanted exactly this information. The dress, the flowers, the guests, the decorations in the church, the champagne at the reception, the carriage that took the newlyweds away. Everything except the expression on the bride's face, which was hidden, and the feelings of the bride, which were not asked for and would not have been printed if offered. The social record of the Gilded Age wedding was, in this sense, a careful omission, a document that recorded the surfaces of the transaction and left the substance to be discovered later, in memoirs and courtrooms, and the private letters of women who had survived the day and spent the following decades finding words for what it had cost. When Anna Gould arrived in Paris in 1895, she was 19 years old, the daughter of Jay Gould, one of the most ruthless and most hated of the robber barons, and she was worth approximately $12 million. This figure was not a secret. It appeared in newspapers. It was discussed at dinner tables. It circulated through the social world of both countries with the matter-of-fact precision of a stock price, because that is essentially what it was, the price of Anna Gould, rendered in the currency of the market that had been established to buy and sell women exactly like her. She was not conventionally pretty. Contemporaries described her with the particular unkindness that the era reserved for women who were rich but not beautiful, as plain, or small, or undistinguished in feature. What she had, underneath the $12 million and the drawbacks of her father's reputation, was an iron will that she had inherited directly from him. The same determination that had made Jay Gould one of the most feared financial operators in American history expressed itself in his daughter as a certainty about what she wanted and a complete readiness to pursue it. What she wanted, with a clarity that could not have been more conventional if it had been assigned to her by the society she moved in, was a title. Not because she had been instructed to want one, though she had been, but because she had absorbed the logic of the world she grew up in with sufficient thoroughness that the want was genuinely her own. A title was the thing that would make the Gould money mean something other than what it had cost to accumulate it. Jay Gould's methods were legendary in their rapacity, and the family fortune carried his reputation like a weight. A title was the solvent that could, over a generation, dissolve that weight, transform new money into old position, make the Goulds not just rich but recognizable in the permanent sense that the Gilded Age most valued. The man who presented himself was Count Boni de Castellane, 27 years old, member of one of the oldest noble families in France, handsome in the specific way that men who have never been required to exert themselves often are, polished, at ease, effortlessly present in any room he entered. He was also, with an equally effortless consistency, spending money he did not have at a rate that alarmed everyone except the people lending it to him. His debts when he met Anna were substantial. His income was not. The match, arranged in Paris while Anna was there to purchase her trousseau for an entirely different engagement, had the quality of a perfect mechanism clicking into place. Anna's money was enormous, and she was prepared to use it. Bonnie's title was genuine, and he was prepared to sell access to it. The marriage took place on March 4th, 1895, in a ceremony attended by every person of any social importance who could find an excuse to attend. The reception was described as the most lavish in New York since the Vanderbilt Ball 12 years earlier. The years that followed were a masterclass in the specific misery that the transatlantic marriage market produced at its most predictable. Bonnie spent. He spent on the scale of someone who had been waiting his entire adult life for a fortune large enough to accommodate his imagination. He built a mansion on the Avenue Foch in Paris that cost $3 million, a pink marble palace with gates that Louis XIV would have found excessive, and rooms that required 50 servants minimum to keep in operation. He threw parties at Versailles. He commissioned paintings, tapestries, sculpture. He purchased carriages and horses and country properties with the enthusiasm of a man who was entirely unconcerned about the gap between income and expenditure, because the income was his wife's, and the expenditure was his own private joy. Anna financed all of this with her inheritance, and with the ongoing income from the Gould estate. She watched Boney spend with the specific expression of a woman who has gotten what she asked for and has only now begun to understand the full terms of the transaction. She was a countess. The title was real and freely acknowledged and appeared in every social register in France. She moved through Parisian society with the authority of a woman whose position was not in question. She attended the opera in a box that Bonnie had furnished with the accumulated extravagance of a man who understood luxury entirely in terms of display. But the title was cold comfort, in a marriage that was, from early on, characterized by Bonnie's complete lack of interest in Anna as a person. He was interested in her money. He was interested in the access her fortune gave him to the life he had always believed he deserved. He was interested in the appearance of a successful marriage, which was a social necessity for both of them. He was not interested in Anna. Her opinions did not engage him. Her intelligence, which was considerable, having been educated in the way of serious school children, registered to him as an inconvenience. Her feelings were irrelevant to a man whose feelings about everything were mediated through the question of what they could purchase. The math was simple and brutal. By the time Anna divorced him, in 1906, Bonnie had spent more than half of her $12 million inheritance. The calculations laid out in the divorce proceedings read like a corporate post-mortem. So many millions on the mansion, so many on entertainments, so many on country properties purchased and maintained and eventually sold at a loss. So many on the general upkeep of a lifestyle that had always been calibrated to the next level of expenditure rather than the current level of income. 11 years of marriage, $6 million approximately gone, an apartment at Versailles as a particularly expensive footnote. Hannah's determination asserted itself at the end as completely as it had at the beginning. She divorced Bonnie, which required in Catholic France an act of legal separation rather than a formal dissolution, but which achieved the same practical end, and she immediately identified her next title. 2 years after separating from Bonnie, she married Hélie de Talleyrand-Périgord, Prince de Sagan, a descendant of the famous Talleyrand whose diplomatic manoeuvres had shaped the post-Napoleonic world. The title was higher, the man was quieter. The marriage, which lasted until his death in 1937, was by all accounts substantially more comfortable than its predecessor. Anna Gould, in other words, got what she paid for twice. The first time, she overpaid. The second time, she was more careful about the contract. She died in 1961 as the Duchesse de Talleyrand, having navigated 6 decades of French aristocratic life with the iron will she'd inherited from a father the French aristocracy would have found utterly impossible to receive. The title redeemed the name. The name, in time, was forgotten. Helena Zimmermann's experience was both more ordinary and, in its slow grinding quality, harder. Her father was Eugene Zimmermann, who had made his fortune through Standard Oil and various railroad investments, and Helena was his only child, which made her, in the marriage market of 1900, an extremely desirable acquisition. The suitor who acquired her was Kim, the 9th Duke of Manchester, 20 years old and drowning in debt that he was managing before their engagement with a strategy of remarkable audacity. He would announce false engagements to wealthy women, allowing his creditors to assume that a dowry was imminent, and then quietly disengage before anyone noticed the absence of an actual bride. Estimates of how many women he had falsely claimed to be engaged to ranged, in the accounts of the era, from several to as many as 22. Each announcement bought him a few more months of solvency. Each quiet dissolution cost him nothing beyond the mild social awkwardness of an explanation, because the women involved, who had not consented to be part of the arrangement, were the ones who suffered any reputational inconvenience. Eugene Zimmermann knew what the Duke was. He had done his research, or his lawyers had. The evidence was not hidden. The Duke's financial situation was a matter of semi-public record, and his behaviour with the false engagements had generated enough comment that anyone who asked the right questions would have found it. But Helena's mother wanted the title. A duke was a duke, regardless of his methods. The debts could be managed. That was what the Zimmermann money was for. The important thing was the rank. The wedding took place in November of 1900 at St. Thomas Church in New York, the same church where Consuelo Vanderbilt had wept through her wedding 5 years earlier. Helena walked down the same aisle in a transaction that was, if anything, more nakedly commercial than Consuelo's had been. At least the Marlborough family had not announced the engagement to 17 other women in the preceding years. The Duke of Manchester's approach to matrimony had been openly predatory, and yet here was Helena, walking toward him in the church that had witnessed the era's most famous forced marriage, with her dowry already calculated and her father's reluctance already overridden. The money vanished in the way that money in the service of a determined spender always vanishes, quickly, completely, and without producing anything that could be pointed to as a reason. The Duke gambled. He kept mistresses in London and on the continent with the casual entitlement of a man who had never been required to account for his behaviour to anyone, and who saw no particular reason to begin simply because he had a wife. He maintained a lifestyle of champagne and tailored suits and first-class cabins, each element of which was paid for by the Zimmermann fortune transmitted through the mechanisms of the marriage settlement. Helena's father, watching this from Cincinnati, rewrote his will. When Eugene Zimmermann died in 1914, his estate was structured in trusts designed to protect Helena and her children, while ensuring that the Duke of Manchester received nothing directly. It was a father's posthumous attempt to defend his daughter using the only weapon available to him, the careful legal management of money. The Duke challenged the will. He lost. The marriage staggered on for another 17 years, sustained by inertia and the social impossibility of divorce, before Helena finally ended it in 1931. She was 51. 30 years had passed since the wedding at St. Thomas Church. 30 years during which the Duke of Manchester had burned through a substantial portion of the Zimmerman fortune with the cheerful thoroughness of a man who had always understood the money to be his right. The title that had justified the transaction was still there, technically. Helena retained the courtesy of being a former duchess after the divorce, but the courtesy was empty in the way that titles always are when the substance has been stripped from them. What remained was the arithmetic of years, the years Helena was 19 and married, the years she was in her 20s and 30s and 40s, watching the money go and the marriage hollow out, the years her father was alive and watching, and unable to do anything except what he eventually did, which was to die and leave instructions for protecting what was left. The years after his death, when the Duke denied the expected inheritance, became more rather than less difficult. The years of endurance, of managing a life inside the requirements of a transaction she had not entirely chosen and could not easily leave. The room holds these arithmetic of years like a closed hand, not tight, gently, the way you hold something that needs to be remembered without being clutched. Outside, the night has deepened to that particular shade of dark that comes only in the hours when even the sleepless are finally sleeping. The house is quiet all the way down. You can feel the quiet in the floor, in the walls, in the slow cooling of the air. There is no more to solve tonight. There is only this, the dark and the quiet, and the night moving through on its own slow schedule, carrying nothing with it that it cannot put down. The French connection to the transatlantic marriage market operated on different terms from the British one, and it produced different kinds of transactions. France's aristocracy, stripped of political power by the Republic, was in some ways even more dependent on the cash infusions that American marriages could provide, because without the legislative functions that gave English lords some institutional claim to public resources, the French nobility had nothing but its social position to offer, and social position required constant maintenance. Bonnie de Castellan's expenditures, as they accumulated through the years of his marriage to Anna Gould, read like an inventory of every possible way that a man of unlimited imagination and limited capital can convert his wife's fortune into a monument to his own taste. The Pink Palace on the Avenue Foch alone cost $3 million to build and furnish, a figure that represents in modern terms something close to $80 million spent on a single house in Paris that served primarily as the backdrop for Bonnie's social ambitions. The house was genuinely beautiful. Contemporary observers agreed on this. Its rooms, designed by the finest craftsmen available, were models of the particular French aesthetic that Bonnie personified. Ordered, elaborate, referencing the grandeur of the Ancien regime without quite achieving it. Bonnie gave parties that were described in the press as among the most spectacular in Paris during the Belle Époque. He recreated Versailles' entertainments in the gardens of Versailles itself, with hundreds of servants in period costume and illuminations that turned the night to a version of the 18th century. The cost of a single such entertainment could have sustained a middle-class French family for several years. The cost of his lifestyle in total, over the 11 years of the marriage, amounted to the comfortable destruction of approximately half of one of the largest fortunes in America. Anna watched this with the expression of a woman who was getting exactly what she had paid for, and had only recently come to understand the precise nature of what she had purchased. She was a countess. The title was real and recognized. She moved through Parisian society with a freedom that the Gould name, which carried the weight of her father's predatory reputation, had not purchased in New York. Paris was better. The aristocratic world received her, used her money, admired her ability to fund the lifestyle her husband required, and treated her, if not with warmth exactly, with the considered respect that a very large fortune consistently commanded. The divorce that finally ended the arrangement in 1906 was both an escape and a kind of defeat. Anna had gotten the title, she had gotten the position. She had paid, over 11 years, the full price of the transaction, and had received, in return, a social identity that was real and would last for the remainder of her very long life. The defeat was the specific defeat of having been used as an instrument, having been valued entirely for what she carried rather than who she was, in a transaction that had never pretended to be anything else. Her subsequent marriage to the Prince de Sagan, who was related to the famous Talleyrand, was a more careful negotiation. She had learned from the first marriage what the terms of these arrangements actually were, and what questions it was useful to ask before the contract was signed. The second husband was quieter. He was older. He did not build mansions or recreate Versailles. He was, by all accounts, a person of genuine cultivation and some warmth, and the marriage lasted until his death 30 years later. Anna had bought herself a better deal the second time, because she had learned at considerable expense what a bad deal looked like. The Pink Palace on the Avenue Foch, the house that Bonnie de Castellane built with Anna Gould's money and Anna Gould's tolerance, and the absolute certainty of a man who had never had to justify his expenditures, stood for years as one of the most admired private residences in Paris. Its rooms were genuine masterpieces of the Belle Epoque aesthetic, each one a demonstration of Bonnie's genuine and educated taste. He was not a fool. He was not a Philistine. He was a man of real cultivation who had simply never been required to pay for that cultivation himself. The distinction matters because it complicates the simple narrative of exploitation. Bonnie genuinely loved beauty. He genuinely understood the history of French decorative arts. He genuinely cared about the quality of what he was creating, in a way that went beyond display and extended into the particular pleasure of a person who has found, in the arrangement of rooms, a form of artistic expression. The house was good. It was expensive and excessive, and built with money he did not earn, but it was good. Anna knew this. It was one of the complications of her position. She was married to a man who was spending her into impoverishment, and she was watching him spend it on things that were genuinely worth spending money on. The problem was not Bonnie's taste. The problem was the arithmetic, the gap between what the spending produced and what it cost, and the way the cost fell entirely on her while the product was enjoyed entirely by him. The house was his expression. The money was her constraint, and the constraint was invisible in the drawing room where everyone was admiring the expression. Her iron will, which she had inherited from a father who was widely regarded as the most ruthless man in American finance, operated on a different schedule than Bonnie's charm. He spent money with the ease of breath. She watched. She calculated. She maintained, over the years, a precise internal accounting of what the marriage was costing and what it was returning, and when the calculation reached a point that her father's daughter found unacceptable, she acted. The divorce was not impulsive. It was the end of a long and careful analysis, executed with the specific competence of someone who had spent 11 years gathering the information she needed and constructing the position from which to use it. The money she had lost was gone. That was the arithmetic's final column, and it could not be disputed. But what she had acquired in exchange for the money was a social position in France that was genuinely hers, not dependent on the marriage continuing, not subject to the Duke's goodwill, but real and recognized and attached to her rather than to him. She was a countess. She had been presented at every court that mattered. She had moved through the highest levels of French and European society for 11 years, and had done so, by all accounts, with the grace and intelligence that her position required. The title remained. The house would be sold. The money would be divided. But the position, in a world that had decided what positions were worth, was something that even a spectacular divorce could not entirely remove. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. Blenheim Palace had 187 rooms. This is a fact that sounds like a boast, and was. But it was also, for the women who lived there, something else entirely. It was a measure of the distance between one place and another, between the warm, overheated, central heated comfort of a Fifth Avenue mansion and the magnificent wind-inhabited, stone-cold reality of a Broke English estate in winter. The palace had been built in the early 18th century as a gift from Queen Anne to the first Duke of Marlborough, in recognition of his victories against the French. It was designed by John Vanbrugh, who was primarily a playwright before he became an architect, which perhaps explains why the building felt more like a stage set than a house. It was enormous in the specific way of things designed to communicate power rather than facilitate life. Its facades were symmetrical and severe. Its courtyards were vast and exposed. Its interior corridors stretched for distances that required a degree of commitment to traverse. In winter, The temperature inside Blenheim was approximately the same as the temperature outside, minus the wind. There was no central heating. The fires that burned in individual rooms sent their warmth upward and outward, with the thoughtless generosity of things that have no interest in being efficient. Stone walls, which had been absorbing cold for 200 years, radiated it back with interest. Consuelo Vanderbilt, who arrived at Blenheim in the winter following her wedding, and found that the palace she had purchased with her entire future was essentially a cold storage facility with art, wore furs indoors. This was not eccentricity. It was a necessity that her predecessors had addressed in exactly the same way for generations. The plumbing was a separate adventure. The kitchens occupied a wing so far removed from the dining room that food arrived at table, having completed a journey long enough to lose most of its enthusiasm for being hot. The household staff numbered in the dozens, each one operating according to protocols that had been in place since the first Duke's time, and that were maintained with the conservative devotion of people who understood that their position in the house depended on the stability of the institution. The protocols were not described anywhere that Consuelo could find. They were simply known by everyone except the new Duchess, who was expected to learn them through observation and to implement them correctly from the moment she was required to. Her mother-in-law, the Dowager Duchess Albertha, had made the terms of the arrangement clear almost immediately. The first duty of the new Duchess was to produce a male heir. This was not a social nicety or a gentle suggestion framed as a hope. It was a command rooted in the family's deepest anxiety, because without a direct male heir, the dukedom would pass to a junior branch of the Churchill family, and the Dowager Duchess reportedly had views about the junior branch that she expressed with the unguarded candour of a woman who felt her own position gave her the right to say exactly what she thought. The junior branch included a young man named Winston, then in his early 20s, already beginning to demonstrate the ambition and the gift for self-publicity that would eventually make him one of the defining figures of the century. The Dowager Duchess, if the family accounts are reliable, was not his greatest admirer. Her concerns about the succession were not, it seems, motivated by any great enthusiasm for the young Winston's advancement. Preventing that outcome was, in her framing, simply a matter of dynastic good management. Consuelo understood her function. She fulfilled it. Her first son, John Albert William Spencer Churchill, was born in 1897, barely 2 years after the wedding. Her second son, Ivor Charles, followed in 1898. The machinery of aristocratic succession was satisfied. Blenheim would pass to a Consuelo-born heir. The Dowager Duchess presumably regarded this development with the relief of a woman whose primary professional concern had been addressed. What happened in the marriage after the heirs were produced was essentially nothing. The Duke was distant. He was formal in public and cold in private, which is the reverse of the arrangement that most people find sustainable over time. He spent money with the unquestioning assumption of a man who had never been required to earn any. Vanderbilt money on art, on renovations, on the water terraces that he rebuilt to an extraordinary standard of beauty using capital that Consuelo had brought from New York with no particular say in how it would be used. The palace looked magnificent. The marriage did not. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only extraordinary wealth can produce. It is the loneliness of someone surrounded at all times by people whose relationship to you is defined entirely by their function, who cannot be friends, because friendship requires equality, and who cannot be confidants, because confidentiality requires trust that the household structure makes impossible. Consuelo had servants. She had household staff. She had the Duke's social circle, which received her as the Duchess and regarded her as the American who had saved the palace. She had, in the way of women in her position, almost no one who knew her. The letters she wrote home during the early years of the marriage were carefully cheerful. She described the grounds, the art, the social events. She wrote about the people she was meeting with the tone of someone who is participating enthusiastically in a life that is not quite hers. The tone never cracked in the letters that have survived. Consuelo had been trained too well for the tone to crack in a letter that might be read by the wrong eyes. But the things she left out were as legible to anyone who knew what they were looking for as the things she included. She left out the cold. She left out the distance at the table, the silence in the corridors, the specific quality of a house that has never been organised around the comfort of its inhabitants, but around the display of their position. She left out the experience of sitting at the far end of an enormous dining table, separated from her husband by 15 feet of polished oak, and a silence that the crystal stemware reflected back without comment. She left out the feeling of being, in the most fundamental sense beside the point, eyed. The houses that money had built and women had saved were beautiful. This is true and cannot be argued away. Blenheim is genuinely one of the finest examples of English Baroque architecture in existence. Its grounds, maintained partly by Vanderbilt Capital, are extraordinary. Its art collection, which Consuelo's money had helped preserve and expand, contains objects of genuine importance. Visitors who walk through its rooms today are walking through something real, through a version of the past that has been kept alive precisely because at a critical moment, a girl from New York married a man she did not love and gave him everything she had. The other houses tell the same story at different scales. Flore's Castle in Scotland, seat of the Dukes of Roxburgh, was rescued by the marriage of the 8th Duke to Maygola, whose family fortune derived from New York real estate. Kimbolton Castle, the seat of the Dukes of Manchester, survived on Zimmerman money for as long as the marriage that generated it lasted. Highclere Castle, which later generations would know through the fiction of Downton Abbey, was another great house sustained in part by the patient infusion of American wealth through strategic unions. The geography of England is dotted with these monuments, places that stand partly because a woman crossed an ocean and surrendered the terms of her own life to maintain them. The guidebooks, when they mention the women at all, mention them in the context of the men. The Vanderbilt Duchess, the Zimmerman Duchess. The names appear as adjectives rather than subjects, as qualifiers on the men they married rather than as people in their own right. The catalogue of their contributions, measured in millions, appears in the footnotes of the architectural histories. The catalogue of what they endured to make those contributions does not appear in the architectural histories at all, because architecture does not record the temperature of the corridors in January or the quality of the silence at the dinner table. There is a room at Blenheim that Consuelo particularly loved. She wrote about it in her memoir decades later, with the particular clarity of someone describing a place they had been to only once, and had carried with them ever since. It was a smaller room, not one of the staterooms, not the long library with its extraordinary organ, or the great hall with its battle scenes, or the saloon where the family portraits hung in their elaborate frames. It was a smaller room with a window that faced east, and in the mornings in spring and summer, the light came through that window and fell on the floor in a way that she found, despite everything, genuinely beautiful. She collected these moments carefully. The light in the east-facing room, the sound of the water terraces, audible from certain parts of the garden when the wind was from the right direction, the way the grounds looked in early November, when the trees were bare and the distance was visible and the whole estate resolved into its essential geometry, park and palace, and the long avenue of elms that led from the gates. She collected them because they were hers in a way the rest of the place was not. The room was not hers, it belonged to the palace, and the palace belonged to the institution, and the institution had consumed her fortune and her youth. But the light in the room, in the mornings, when she was alone, that was hers. Women learn to be collectors of such moments. It is a skill that develops in direct proportion to the absence of larger freedoms, the capacity to find sufficiency in small things, precisely because the large things are unavailable. Consuelo, who had been denied the right to choose her own husband, learned to find genuine pleasure in a window's light. The pleasure was real. The learning was expensive. The rooms of these great houses held all of this. The fireplaces that could not adequately heat the corridors, the dining tables too long for genuine conversation, the windows that offered views of grounds maintained by other people's labour, the bedrooms with their separate dressing rooms and their separate schedules and their carefully maintained privacy, which was a kind of loneliness formalised and given architectural expression. In these rooms, women from New York and Cincinnati and Chicago learned to inhabit a life that had been purchased for them by their mothers and maintained by their own endurance. The candles are very low now. The windows have been dark for hours. The house, whatever house you are imagining as you listen to this, has settled into its final quiet, the deep quiet that comes when everything that was going to be done today has been done and everything that will need to be done tomorrow has not yet begun. Let the rooms recede. Let the long corridors empty themselves of everything but the faint memory of footsteps. Let the fireplaces cool to their grey morning state. The houses are still. The women who saved them are finally, after a very long time at rest. The women who lived in these houses did not hate them. It is important to get this right because the temptation is to read their experience as purely miserable, as decades of cold corridors and silent dinners unrelieved by any genuine satisfaction. The reality was more complicated, and the complication is part of the story. Consuelo found genuine beauty in Blenheim. The water terraces that her money had rebuilt were extraordinary. The library, with its ceiling painted by Thornhill and its organ that could be heard through the palace's upper floors on still mornings, was a room she came to love with the particular devotion of someone who has discovered that even a prison can contain something worth looking at. She became, over the years, a person of genuine consequence in the English charitable world. She sat on hospital committees. She visited the poor districts of London with a consistency that was not performative but practical, that resulted in actual improvements to actual conditions, funded by the Vanderbilt fortune and organised by the Marlborough title, and managed with the administrative intelligence of a woman who had been trained since childhood to run complicated operations. The work gave her an identity outside the palace, an identity that was hers rather than the Duke's, and the relief of that distinction was evident in the letters of that period. The English aristocracy had, by the 1890s, developed a slightly warmer attitude toward American wives than the drawing-room anecdotes suggested. The initial period of guarded contempt, the whispers about American loudness, American vulgarity, American ignorance of the codes, had given way in many households to a more pragmatic appreciation. The American wives who stayed were useful. They brought energy and organisational capacity and a democratic directness that the English upper class found simultaneously baffling and effective. They organised things, they finished things, they attended to the management of households that had been running on inertia and tradition for so long that no one had noticed they were falling apart. Consuelo organised Blenheim with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had been trained by Alva Vanderbilt, which is to say she organised it with the thoroughness of someone who did not know what less than thorough looked like. The household staff, the menus, the entertainment calendar, the maintenance schedules for a building that required constant attention and regular intervention to prevent the usual English country house entropy. All of this she managed with a quiet competence that the Duke did not acknowledge and did not need to, because it was simply the background condition of his continued comfort. The palace attracted visitors. It was the nature of great houses in this era to attract people whose reasons for visiting range from genuine friendship to careful social positioning, to the simple human desire to see what $8 million of American money and centuries of English history looked like when combined. Consuelo received these visitors with the grace and attention that the role required. She showed them the long library and the saloon, and the portraits of the first Duke in his armour, winning the battles that had earned the palace as a gift. She did not show them the east-facing room with the morning light. That room was hers. Mary Lee Curzon, who had travelled further from Newport than any of them, to a vice-regal throne in Delhi, managed her extraordinary position with a combination of natural ability and sheer physical endurance that impressed everyone who worked with her and worried everyone who loved her. Her husband, Lord Curzon, was brilliant and difficult, a man of genuine intellectual gifts who treated his wife with a particular combination of public admiration and private dismissiveness that brilliant, difficult men often managed in this era. Mary was valuable to him as a hostess, as a diplomat's wife, who could charm exactly the right people at exactly the right moment, and as the financial foundation on which his political career rested. Whether he valued her as a person is a question the historical record does not clearly answer. The servants who maintained these great houses occupied a world that the histories have largely ignored, and their perspective on the dollar princesses is almost entirely lost. But what fragments survive suggest a response that was more complicated than either the deference that their positions required or the resentment that the distance between their circumstances and their employers might have generated. The American wives were, in general, better employers than the English aristocracy. This is not a high bar. The English aristocracy's record as employers was distinguished primarily by its assumption that service was a permanent condition into which certain families had been born and would remain. The American women brought with them a different set of assumptions, not necessarily more egalitarian, but different. They had grown up in households where the servants were employed rather than inherited, where the relationship was understood as a commercial transaction rather than a social arrangement, and where the quality of the service depended on whether the employer was making the position worth having. They paid well. They were often more specific in their expectations and more predictable in their demands than the English families who had been in the same houses for generations. The staff at Blenheim, who had served the Churchill family for decades, regarded Consuelo with a combination of caution and something close to respect. Mary Leiter Curzon, who managed the viceregal household in Delhi, with the organisational precision of a woman who had spent her entire life watching her mother manage the most complicated social machinery in Chicago, was regarded by the Indian Civil Service as one of the most effective viceroys in memory. The staff of the Government House in Calcutta and the Viceroy's Lodge in Simla operated under her direction with an efficiency that her predecessors had not achieved. This was not merely an administrative accomplishment. It was a demonstration of the specific competence that the dollar princesses brought to their positions, the competence of women who had been trained to manage complexity, and who applied that training once they had a position large enough to require it, with the thoroughness that their training had produced. The physical toll of these positions was significant and rarely acknowledged. Mary Leiter Curzon died at 36 of the accumulated effects of a spinal injury that the constant demands of her role had not allowed her to address properly. Helena Zimmerman aged visibly through the years of her marriage, the specific aging of someone who is spending energy at a rate that her life does not replenish. Consuelo, who lived to 87 and had 30 years of genuine happiness in France, paid her physical price differently in the decade after her escape from Blenheim, in the years of legal proceedings and social adjustment, and the gradual reconstruction of a self that the palace had done its best to manage rather than allow. The houses endured. They were better at enduring than the women who had saved them, because houses do not feel the cold in the corridors, or the silence at the dinner table, or the weight of decades spent performing a role for which there was no exit. They simply stand and accumulate the patina of time and receive visitors who walk through them with the particular reverence that age and beauty inspire, and do not need to be told what they cost. The particular quality of light in large old houses, the light that falls through windows too tall for a single person to seem proportionate to, was something that several of the American brides wrote about with a consistency suggesting it made an impression. Not the warmth of it, because there was rarely warmth in these houses, but the quality of it, the way it travelled across floors of ancient stone or marquetry that had been walked on for 2 centuries, the way it fell on portraits of ancestors whose resemblance to the living inhabitants was sometimes striking and sometimes entirely absent. The houses had a visual language that the women had not learned to read before they arrived. They spent their first years learning it. The reading was slow because the language was dense with references they had not been taught. A coat of arms above a doorway was not just decoration, it was a historical argument, a claim about who this family was and had been, and how that family understood itself in relation to the world outside these walls. The furniture was not just furniture, it was evidence, a material record of choices made by people who had occupied these same rooms in earlier centuries and had found the same problems of cold and light and distance insufficiently solved. To live in these houses was to live inside a continuous argument about the past, and the American brides who had grown up in houses designed to be impressive rather than inhabited found the argument both fascinating and, in the early years, somewhat exhausting. Of the 454 American women who married titled Europeans between 1870 and 1914, fewer than 60 divorced or separated. That is less than 15%. The number is sometimes cited as evidence of the era's social conservatism, of the power of convention and religious obligation, and the simple inertia of marriages that had nowhere in particular to go. All of these things were true, but the number also reflects something else. The extraordinary cost for women who had purchased their positions through enormous financial and personal sacrifices of leaving them. The legal machinery was formidable and was designed at every stage to discourage departure. Under English common law in the late 19th century, a married woman's legal identity was substantially subsumed within her husband's. The reforms of 1882 and 1893 had improved the situation on paper, but in practice the entanglement of a wife's wealth with her husband's household, his debts, and his estate was such that separation required the kind of legal expertise and financial resources that were available only to women whose families had both the means and the will to support the effort. The social costs were even steeper, and they operated at every level of the world these women inhabited. A divorced woman was dropped from guest lists. She was the subject of drawing-room whispers that could reach across an ocean with astonishing speed. The doors that had opened for the Duchess closed for the divorcee, not always and not everywhere, but enough that the social architecture that had been built through years of careful positioning could collapse in a season. Her children bore the stigma. The phrase broken home carried in the vocabulary of the era a moral weight that is difficult to overstate. A home broken by divorce was not merely unfortunate. It was a failure of the social fabric, and the responsibility for that failure landed by convention disproportionately on the wife. Her family, having invested enormous sums in the marriage that produced the title, faced a different kind of cost. The social capital that had been purchased, the title, the position, the drawing-room acknowledgement, would evaporate the moment the marriage ended. A divorced duchess retained the courtesy title by convention, but she lost the position. She was the former duchess, which was a phrase that managed to combine acknowledgement and dismissal in a single breath. The investment, measured in millions, had produced a return measured in years, and the years, when the divorce was finalized, could not be recovered. Many families, calculating this arithmetic, responded to a daughter's plea for help with a calculation that was devastating in its simplicity. The title is worth more than your happiness. The unhappiness would pass or become manageable. The title was permanent. Stay. Those who left anyway found that the journey was exactly as expensive as the warning suggested. Consuelo's formal separation from the Duke came in 1906, after 11 years of a marriage that had hollowed out with the slow thoroughness of weather on stone. The separation was negotiated quietly, with lawyers on both sides managing the financial terms, and both parties maintaining a public facade of dignified regret that fooled no one who had been paying attention. But separation was not divorce. Consuelo remained the Duchess of Marlborough. The full divorce did not come until 1921, a full 26 years after the wedding at St. Thomas Church. 26 years. The arithmetic of that duration is worth sitting with. Consuelo was 18 when she married, weeping through the ceremony behind a veil that hid her face. She was 44 when the divorce was finalized. She had spent more than half her life in a marriage that began with coercion and ended with legal documents. The years between had contained her sons, her philanthropy, her gradually expanding set of friendships and purposes built around the spaces her husband did not occupy. But they had contained all of that within the formal structure of a marriage she had not chosen, attached to a man who had never chosen her. The process of divorce, when it finally became possible, required navigating both English civil law and, eventually, the Catholic Church's annulment process. The civil divorce addressed the legal and financial terms. The Church annulment addressed the question of whether the marriage had been sacramentally valid in the first place, which, given that Consuelo had been coerced into it by a mother threatening to die if her daughter refused, was a question with a reasonably clear answer. The annulment hearing brought Alva Vanderbilt Belmont before the Vatican's Rota Tribunal in 1926. By this point, Alva was in her 70s, famous as a suffragist, celebrated as a champion of women's rights, and also the person most directly responsible for the coercion that the tribunal was being asked to assess. Her testimony was, by any standard, extraordinary. She confirmed the locked room. She confirmed the emotional blackmail. She confirmed the threat of cardiac death. She used the phrase absolute power to describe her relationship to her daughter's will. It was the most complete confession of maternal coercion in the historical record of the Gilded Age. The annulment was granted. The Church declared the marriage null. 31 years after the ceremony, Consuelo was, in the eyes of the institution that had performed it, free. The gap between the legal divorce and the Church annulment, 15 years, is a detail that passes quickly in the historical accounts, but it contains within it a full set of human experiences. The legal freedom of 1921 followed by 15 more years during which Consuelo was, in the faith she'd been raised in, still married to a man she had not chosen. What did leaving cost? In material terms, the legal fees of 2 continents, the expenses of maintaining an independent life in the years of limbo between separation and divorce, the portion of her dwindling Vanderbilt funds that went to the machinery of dissolution rather than the purposes of living. In social terms, the years of reduced invitations, the drawing-room coolness, the gradual sorting of acquaintances into those who remained and those who found the situation awkward, and expressed that awkwardness through absence. In personal terms, the knowledge that her sons were growing up in a household defined by a public disintegration, that the title she had been bought to obtain was now more shadow than substance. What leaving gave her? Freedom, eventually. The freedom to live in France with a man who loved her, in the way that people who have chosen each other love, without the transaction underneath, without the ledger that converted affection into obligation. Jacques Balsan, the French aviator who had apparently been quietly devoted to Consuelo since encountering her at a society event in the 1890s, proposed the moment the divorce was finalised. The wedding was private. There were no 2,000 guests, no police controlling crowds, no newspaper reporters cataloguing every stitch of the gown. There were two people who had chosen each other, late and deliberately, after years of waiting that one of them had spent in a cold palace and the other had spent in an airplane. The second marriage, by every account, was genuinely happy. Not the performed happiness of aristocratic obligation, not the face arranged into the expression expected of a duchess at a public event, but the real thing. Consuelo gardened. She entertained on her own terms. She had opinions that were sought out rather than managed. She was treated as a person who had a mind worth engaging rather than a function worth maintaining. The simplicity of this was, by the time she reached it, almost unbearably moving. Helena Zimmermann's exit was slower but arrived at last. The divorce from the Duke of Manchester came in 1931, when Helena was 51, and 30 years of the marriage had been spent watching the Zimmermann fortune diminish, under the systematic pressure of a man for whom spending was both recreation and assertion. She subsequently married the 10th Earl of Kinnall in 1937, a second marriage that was quieter and substantially more stable than the first, and that lasted until the Earl's death. That she chose, again, a titled Englishman says something, either about the depth of the world she'd been absorbed into, or about the genuine affection that was possible, apparently even in this market, or about both. The women who did not leave paid a different kind of price. Their accommodations were internal, invisible, expressed not in legal proceedings but in the daily management of a life that contained too little joy for its expense. They learned to navigate a husband's drinking or gambling or infidelity with the same practical competence they applied to managing a large household. They developed strategies for survival that involved separate schedules, separate bedrooms, separate social lives conducted under the same ancient roof. They found purposes outside the marriage, in philanthropy, in politics, in the artistic and intellectual worlds that were, by the late 19th century, beginning to admit women on terms that did not require a husband's permission. Consuelo herself, during the years between separation and divorce, threw herself into charitable work with an energy that suggested she was finding in service what the palace had not given her. She founded hostels for young women in London. She supported medical charities that served the poor districts of the East End. She worked with social reformers on housing and health initiatives. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The woman who had no power over her own life devoted herself to improving the lives of women who had even less. The woman who could not choose her own husband chose instead to choose causes. It was not freedom, but it was the closest available equivalent. And in doing it, Consuelo was following a path that many of the dollar princesses had found before her. The path of converting constraint into purpose, of building a life within the available space that was genuinely worth living, even if the space itself had been shaped by forces entirely outside her control. The cost of leaving, the cost of staying. Both figures were real, and both were enormous, and the women who paid them paid with years of their lives at a rate that no contract had specified and no lawyer had negotiated. The ledgers of the transatlantic marriage market recorded the dowries and the settlements. They did not record the years. The night is at its deepest now. The sky beyond the windows, if you were to look, would be the blue-black of the hours furthest from both sunrise and sunset. The sounds of the house have finished settling. There is no more movement, no more adjustment. Let your body remember what it knows about being still. Let the story carry what remains of your attention lightly, the way water carries fallen leaves, not holding, not pulling, just moving. The custody questions were often the most brutal element of a divorce proceeding, and they were the ones that most clearly revealed the legal architecture's hostility to women who sought to leave. English law, in the late 19th century, favoured the father in custody disputes as a matter of principle rather than circumstance. A mother who left the family home could find herself separated from her children not temporarily, as a function of the proceedings, but permanently, as a function of the legal presumption that the father's household was the appropriate home for the children of the marriage. This was not theoretical. Women who had navigated to the point of formal separation or divorce and then discovered that the price of their freedom was the loss of access to their children. The emotional leverage this created was deployed, sometimes deliberately and sometimes as a simple function of the legal system, to keep women in situations they had decided to leave. A woman who had endured 15 years of a miserable marriage might find, at the moment of decision, that the cost of leaving included not just the social exile and the financial settlement, but the daily presence of the children she had raised. The system had not been designed to torment women specifically. It had been designed to serve the interests of property and lineage, and in doing so it treated children as a form of property attached to the father's estate. The children bore the father's name. They would inherit the father's title. They would, in the logic of the system, remain in the environment where that inheritance was prepared for. The mother's role in creating and caring for those children was acknowledged and then set aside when it came into conflict with the structural requirements of the aristocratic order. Some women found routes around this. The women with the most money and the most determined family support could retain good lawyers and fight the custody proceedings with a thoroughness that sometimes produced different outcomes. The women with the most sympathetic public profiles, whose stories of marital mistreatment had been shared carefully with the right people and had generated the right kind of social pressure, could find that the legal system was somewhat more flexible than its formal rules suggested. But these routes required resources that were not evenly distributed, and the women who navigated them successfully were a small minority of those who needed to. The endurance of the majority, the women who stayed year after year in marriages that were legal contracts rather than living relationships, was not passive. It was active, managed, strategic endurance. They created lives within the available space. They cultivated friendships with other women in similar situations, building networks of mutual support and understanding that the social world officially did not acknowledge but practically depended on. They found purposes, charitable work, artistic interests, political causes that gave their days a structure and their lives a meaning that the marriages themselves no longer provided. The generation that followed these women looked back at them with a mixture of pity and incomprehension. How could they have stayed? The answer, when examined carefully, is that the world gave them almost nowhere else to go, and that the women who did find somewhere else to go paid a price that the world made sure was visible to every woman who was contemplating the same decision. The price was real, the visibility was intentional, and the women who nevertheless paid it, and left, and built lives on the other side of the departure, deserve to be remembered for what the departure cost them, not just for the lives they built afterward. The specific psychology of endurance in a transactional marriage developed particular characteristics that observers in this era noted but rarely analysed. The women who remained longest in their marriages, who outlasted the most difficult husbands, who managed the financial disasters and the social humiliations and the cold bedrooms with the most sustained equanimity, were not, by most accounts, the women with the least feeling. They were the women with the most developed capacity for compartmentalization, the ability to maintain a functioning emotional interior while presenting, to the world and sometimes to themselves, a surface of perfect composure. This compartmentalization was not pathology. It was a survival skill, developed in response to a genuine survival requirement. The woman who could not contain her suffering had only a few available options, none of them good. She could become visibly unhappy, which would generate the compassion of her social circle and the management of her husband, neither of which solved anything. She could become privately destructive, the drinking, the overmedication, the slow withdrawal from engagement that characterize several of the more extreme cases in this world. Or she could build, with whatever materials were available, an interior life that the exterior world could not touch. The interior lives that these women built were various and often remarkable. Some were intellectual. The sustained engagement with literature, philosophy, and the history of ideas that gave women who had no formal access to education a genuine relationship to the life of the mind. Some were aesthetic, the management of houses and gardens as genuine creative expression, the cultivation of eye and taste that produced, in several cases, collections and arrangements of lasting quality. Some were spiritual, the private religious practice that, conducted apart from the official performances of aristocratic worship, gave women a relationship to something larger than the social world in which they were trapped. And some were, quietly, political, the development, through years of constrained living, of a clear-eyed analysis of the system that had produced their situation and an equally clear-eyed understanding of how it might be changed. These women did not publish their analyses. They did not, in most cases, join movements or sign petitions. But they raised daughters, and sometimes sons, with a different understanding of what women were capable of and what they were owed, and that understanding entered the next generation with the authority of lived knowledge rather than abstract principle. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont died on January 26, 1933, at the age of 80. At her funeral, the suffragists came. They came in numbers, with a particular solemnity of people honouring someone who had done work that had changed their lives, and they regarded the woman in the casket with the gratitude that movements feel for their benefactors. The National Woman's Party sent representatives. The newspapers ran obituaries praising her courage, her generosity, her lifelong commitment to women's suffrage. They mentioned the Vanderbilt name, they mentioned the Belmont name, they mentioned the votes she had helped to win. They did not mention the girl she had locked in a room. The contradiction at the centre of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont's life is not a small one. It is one of the strangest contradictions in the social history of an era full of strange contradictions. The woman who denied her daughter the right to choose her own husband became one of America's most passionate advocates for women's right to choose everything else. The woman who had used emotional blackmail, physical control, and locked doors to force a teenager into a loveless marriage marched under banners reading Votes for Women. The woman who had trained her daughter's body with a steel rod to perform obedience spent her last decades building organizations dedicated to women's autonomy. How do you understand this? The historical literature on Alva Vanderbilt Belmont has produced a range of answers. Some are harsh. She was a narcissist who transferred her drive for power from the social sphere to the political sphere, and her suffragism was as much about Alva as it was about women. There is evidence for this. Alva had always been about Alva. Her management of Consuelo's life was not simply an expression of the era's norms. It was extraordinary even by the standards of an extraordinarily controlling generation of mothers. Her suffragism was also conducted at a volume that made it impossible to ignore and difficult to share the stage with. But there are other answers, less satisfying but more honest. Alva had watched her daughter suffer. She had engineered the marriage with complete strategic clarity, and had watched, across the years, as the engineering produced something she had not intended or predicted. A young woman's sustained misery, visible to everyone who was paying attention, and increasingly difficult to manage, as Consuelo found ways to express it that Alva could not contain. The controlled girl became, inside the prison of Blenheim, a person with an inner life that her mother could no longer access or direct. The daughter who had been malleable became the woman who endured, and the endurance was its own form of opposition. Alva divorced William K. Vanderbilt in 1895, the same year she engineered Consuelo's marriage to the Duke. The timing is remarkable. She forced her daughter into a union she could not leave, and simultaneously left her own. She named her husband's mistress, demanded and received a settlement that included Marble House in Newport and a substantial annual income, and by 1896 had married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, a man who appears by all accounts to have genuinely respected and cherished her. Oliver Belmont gave Alva something that William K. Vanderbilt had apparently never provided: the experience of being taken seriously as a partner rather than managed as an asset. He asked her opinions. He valued her mind. He treated the formidable intelligence and energy that she had spent decades applying to social warfare as resources rather than inconveniences. And somewhere in the years of that second marriage, Alva began to encounter ideas about women's suffrage, about legal equality, about the systematic nature of women's subordination that gave her formidable capabilities a new direction. Oliver Belmont died in 1908. By then, Alva was already attending suffrage meetings. After his death, she threw herself into the movement with the complete commitment of someone who had been looking for a cause worthy of her ambition. She founded the Political Equality Association. She opened Marble House, the Newport mansion that had cost her first husband $11 million and had been her prize for leaving him, as a platform for suffrage rallies, turning a monument to Gilded Age conspicuous consumption into a meeting room for democratic agitation. The juxtaposition was not lost on anyone, including Alva. She financed newspapers, she organised marches, she helped fund the picketing of the White House in 1917, when suffragists stood outside Woodrow Wilson's gates demanding the vote. Some of those women were arrested, some were force-fed in prison. Alva paid their bail and their legal fees with the same matter-of-fact largesse with which her husband had paid for society balls, as an investment in a cause whose returns she believed in absolutely. She testified before Congress. She gave speeches to thousands. She used her wealth and her connections, the same networks she had spent decades building through social warfare, to open doors for a movement that had struggled for years to be taken seriously by the political establishment. When the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, granting women the right to vote in the United States, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont was among those who had made it happen. The woman who had denied her daughter the right to choose her own husband had helped ensure that all women had the right to choose their own government. In 1926 she appeared before the Vatican's Rota Tribunal to testify in support of Consuelo's annulment petition. She was 73 years old. She sat before the tribunal and said, under oath, that she had forced her daughter to marry the Duke of Marlborough. She confirmed the locked room. She confirmed the emotional pressure. She used the phrase absolute power to describe her relationship to her daughter's will. It was, depending on how you read it, either an act of maternal love arriving 31 years late, or a final assertion of control, the decision of when and how and in what terms the truth would be acknowledged, taken in the same absolute way that everything in Alva's life had been decided. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the contradiction is not in the end a contradiction. Perhaps a woman who has lived entirely within a system that deprives women of power, and who has spent her life accumulating the only kind of power available within that system, and who has inflicted that system's logic on her daughter with total efficiency, and who has then, in the second half of her life, encountered a version of herself from the outside, encountered the suffering she produced, encountered the argument that women deserve choices, can become, through all of that, someone genuinely different without becoming someone entirely new. She bought a chateau in the south of France near the house where Consuelo had settled after her divorce. She spent her final years there, close to the daughter she had once controlled with military precision. Biographers describe their later relationship as an armed truce, visits, conversations, moments of warmth that surfaced through decades of accumulated scar tissue. Not forgiveness, exactly. Something more complicated, more honest, an acknowledgement that the damage was real, and that what remained was also real, and that neither truth cancelled the other out. There were other women in this story who underwent transformations less dramatic but no less genuine. Mary Leiter, who had been positioned by her mother with surgical precision to become the wife of George Curzon, Lord Curzon of Kedleston, and who had reached the highest social position any American woman achieved in the British Empire as Vicereine of India, died at 36. The role her mother had chosen for her consumed her. She gave everything the viceroyalty required, the hospitality, the ceremony, the management of a social machinery on a scale that made Newport look modest, and she gave it with grace and intelligence and genuine ability. She was, by all accounts, one of the most effective vicereines in the history of the position. She was also dying of a spinal injury that the constant demands of the role prevented her from addressing adequately. Her death at 36 was mourned as a tragedy by the people who had been her subjects, who had genuinely valued her qualities, and it was mourned differently by her mother, who had achieved everything she intended, and whose daughter had paid the full price for the achievement. The calculation that the mothers made, that suffering now for security later was a rational trade, required that there be a later. When the daughter died too young to enjoy the security her suffering had purchased, the calculation became retrospectively simply wrong. The suffragettes who attended Alva's funeral knew none of this, or knew it, and filed it in a category that did not undermine their gratitude. Movements require useful histories, and Alva's later history was genuinely useful. genuinely consequential, genuinely brave in the specific political bravery of deploying enormous wealth on behalf of people who had none. The complexity of the earlier history did not negate the later contribution. Both were real. The woman who locked her daughter in a room and the woman who paid bail for women arrested for demanding the vote were the same person, operating in the same way, with the same absolute commitment to whatever she had most recently decided was correct. This is not a comfortable conclusion, but the discomfort is honest, and honesty is, in the end, the only thing that makes any of this worth telling. The funeral was over a long time ago. The mourners dispersed into the January cold of 1933, into a world that was already being dismantled by the Depression and would shortly be remade by war. The era that had produced the transatlantic marriage market was entirely gone by then. The great houses struggling, the aristocracy diminished, the social machinery that had sorted women into duchesses and dollar princesses running down to its final mechanical clanks. What remained was the daughters, who had grown old, who had in many cases outlived the world that had used them, who had, some of them, written books about what had happened and found, in the writing, a kind of authority that the locked rooms and the cold palaces had never permitted. The fire that would not stay lit in the grate of a palace in Oxfordshire is long since ash. The corridors where a woman walked alone are quiet now for a different reason than they were quiet then. Let the quiet spread. Let it fill the space where the words were. Rest is just this. The world going on without you for a while. Let it. The suffrage movement into which Alva threw herself was not gentle. It was not the drawing-room advocacy of well-bred women exchanging petitions over tea. By the second decade of the 20th century, the American suffrage movement had developed a confrontational edge that made the political establishment deeply uncomfortable, and which Alva, whose entire career had been built on the strategic deployment of discomfort, found entirely congenial. She organised, she marched, she sat in rooms with factory workers and domestic servants, and professional women, and the entire range of female experience that her Gilded Age career had kept, carefully at a distance, and she brought to those rooms the specific skills of someone who had been playing at the highest level of American social power for 30 years, the ability to identify what each person needed, the ability to construct an argument that addressed it, the ability to use money as a tool of organisation rather than a symbol of status. The conversion was not without its critics within the movement itself. Some suffragists found Alva's involvement complicated. She arrived with enormous resources and enormous certainty, and an expectation of leadership that was not universally welcomed by women who had been doing the work for decades without either the resources or the prominent name. She could be domineering in the same way she had always been domineering, with the specific certainty of someone who had always gotten what she decided she wanted. This quality, which had served her well in social warfare, required some adjustment for collaborative political work. But she adjusted, or adapted enough to be effective. She learned in her 70s something that she had not needed to learn in the decades of social combat: how to work alongside people rather than simply directing them. Not perfectly, not without friction, but with enough genuine commitment to the goal that the friction was manageable and the collaboration produced results. The National Woman's Party, which she funded substantially, was a more militant organisation than most, committed to the confrontational tactics that she admired. Its members picketed the White House, went to prison, and endured force-feeding in the effort to compel the government to act. Alva paid for the lawyers who got them out, and the newspapers that told their stories. Consuelo's relationship to the suffrage cause was quieter and more personal. She had watched her mother's transformation from tyrant to activist, and had found it, depending on which account you read, either moving or somewhat difficult to process. The woman who had forced her into marriage was now fighting for women's freedom. The hands that had approved the steel brace were now holding picket signs. The logic was there. Alva herself had provided it in the clarity of her testimony about absolute power, but the emotional integration of these two Alvas was work that Consuelo performed, if she performed it at all in private. She was a widow twice over. Eventually, Jacques Balsan died in 1956, and Consuelo lived on for 8 more years, well into her 80s, in the world that they had built together in France. She maintained her friendships, she followed the news, she had lived through the transformation of the world that had produced her. had watched the great houses open to tourists, the Newport cottages become museums, the social machinery that had organised her entire early life rust into historical curiosity, with the specific equanimity of someone who had outlived what needed outliving and found, on the other side of the very long wait, something worth staying for. Her memoir, which she completed in 1953, was written not in the style of grievance but in the style of record. She was not asking for sympathy, she was asking for accuracy. The fairy tale version of the transatlantic marriage, the romantic matches between old world charm and new world fortune, had dominated the popular account for 60 years. The memoir offered the other version: the locked room, the weeping bride, the cold palace, the years of performed happiness in service of an institution that consumed everything she brought and returned very little of equal value. The book said, this is what it was, read it and understand what it cost. The transformation of Marble House, the Newport Palace that Alva had received as a gift from her first husband and had converted into a suffrage meeting room after his death, was one of the more visually dramatic gestures of the suffrage movement. The building itself was an emblem of the Gilded Age in its most concentrated form. $11 million of marble and gold leaf and self-congratulatory grandeur, designed to communicate the absolute supremacy of the Vanderbilt fortune and the social ambition of the woman who occupied it. To open these rooms to suffrage rallies was to conscript the machinery of social exclusion into the service of democratic inclusion. The women who came to these meetings arrived on foot and by trolley from the working-class neighbourhoods of Newport that the Bellevue Avenue cottages had always looked across and never toward. Factory workers, domestic servants, teachers, professional women of various kinds. They walked through the gold ballroom and past the Chinese tea house and into whatever room had been arranged for the occasion, and they sat in chairs that cost more than their monthly wages, in a building that represented everything the suffrage movement was arguing against, and they listened to Alva Vanderbilt Belmont make the case for votes for women with the specific authority of someone who had spent her life inside the system she was now trying to dismantle. The irony was visible to everyone in the room, and Alva did not pretend otherwise. She was, she acknowledged, an unusual spokesperson for women's freedom. She was a woman who had operated at the highest level of a system that was built, in every particular, on the suppression of women's autonomy. She had not merely participated in that system, she had excelled at it. She had deployed its tools with more skill than most of her contemporaries, and she had used that skill to force her daughter into a marriage that represented in miniature everything the suffrage movement existed to prevent. The acknowledgement did not dissolve the contradiction, it simply placed it on the table, where it could be seen and evaluated by the women in the room, who were fully capable of holding two truths simultaneously: that Alva had done harm, and that Alva was now doing good, and that both of these things were true of a person who had found, in the second half of her life, a cause that gave her formidable capabilities a better direction than the one she had previously pointed them in. Consuelo was not present at these meetings. She was living in France by the time her mother's suffrage work was at its height, and the distance between them, geographical, emotional, and historical, was substantial. She followed the work from a distance. She noted in her memoir written decades later that the mother who had denied her every choice had eventually become a woman who fought for every woman's right to choose. She noted this without extensive commentary. The commentary was, perhaps, beyond what the prose style she had chosen, measured, precise, already resolved, was prepared to contain. The generation of women who had been dollar princesses in the 1890s were, by the 1920s and 1930s, old enough to have watched the world that had produced them undergo the complete transformation that the First World War imposed on everything it touched. The great estates that their dowries had saved were now struggling against death duties and agricultural decline of a different kind. The sons who had inherited the titles, the children of the transatlantic unions, were navigating a world in which the social architecture that had given the titles their meaning had been substantially dismantled. The House of Lords had been reformed. The great political families were dispersed into a more democratic arrangement. The specific prestige that a dukedom had commanded in 1895 was still present, but it was a different kind of presence. Historical, referential, a form of cultural inheritance rather than a source of active power. Consuelo, watching all of this from France, found it less melancholy than she might have expected. She had been sold into the old world at its peak, had lived through its decline, and had escaped before its final transformation. She was not nostalgic for Blenheim. She was not nostalgic for the cold or the silence or the particular quality of loneliness that 200 rooms could produce when they were occupied by people who had nothing to say to each other. She was, by the 1930s and 1940s, a woman who had found the life she wanted, modest by comparison with what her mother had purchased for her, genuinely hers, and who could look back at the life she'd not chosen with the specific equanimity of someone who has already paid for everything, and has, at last, received a return worth having. In 1953, Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan published her memoir. She was 76 years old. She had been living in France for most of the preceding 3 decades with Jacques Balsan, the man she had chosen, whose warmth and affection and genuine interest in who she was had given her the second half of a life that the first half had prepared her not to expect. She had gardened, she had entertained, she had read widely and maintained relationships with her sons, both of whom carried the weight of a family history that was public enough to have followed them into their adult lives. The title she chose for the memoir was The Glitter and the Gold. She had been offered other titles by her publisher, and she had declined them all. This one was hers. It was in 4 words a verdict on everything: the glitter of titles and jewels and palaces and the social machinery that produced them, the gold that paid for all of it, and the gap between the two, which was the space in which her actual life had been lived. The glitter blinded, the gold imprisoned. The gap between them was where a person might, if she were lucky and eventually free, discover what she actually was. The book described everything: the steel brace on her spine, the locked room, the tears at the altar, the cold palace, the silent dinners, the husband who had told her, on their honeymoon, that he despised anything that was not British, the years of performing a role she had been sold into, in a country she had not chosen, for an institution she had not consented to serve. She wrote it all with the flat precision of someone for whom the processing had already happened, who was not writing to understand but to document, to place on record a truth that the social world of the Gilded Age had spent 60 years papering over with the gilded language of fairy tales and brilliant matches. The memoir was an act of reclamation. Consuelo had been traded by contract and by force from one family to another. Her body, her dowry, her fertility, and her freedom had been currency in a transaction designed by others. By writing her own story, in her own words from her own perspective, she took back the one thing that no contract could transfer and no mother could lock in a room: the narrative. She had been the object of the story for the first half of her life. She was the author of it for the second. The book also served as testimony for a generation. Consuelo was not the only dollar princess who had suffered in the way she described, but she was the most famous and the most articulate. Her memoir gave form and language to an experience that hundreds of American women had lived through: the experience of being traded for social position, of being valued for what they carried rather than who they were, of being maintained in a life that had been built around their function rather than their personhood. Most of those women left no record. Their suffering was private, absorbed into the fabric of their households, visible only to the servants who made the beds and the ladies' maids who saw the expression on a face before it was prepared for public view. Consuelo spoke for them, not perfectly, not completely, but with enough clarity that the general shape of the experience could be seen. The response to the memoir was complicated, as the response to honesty usually is. Some reviewers praised it for its dignity and restraint, which it had, in abundance. Others found in it an indictment of the social system that they themselves had participated in or benefited from, and responded with the particular irritation of people who have been accurately described. The aristocratic world that had received Consuelo as a necessary ornament received her memoir with something closer to cold acknowledgement. The book was there, it said what it said, it could not be undone. The Duke of Marlborough, the 9th Duke who had married Consuelo for her money, and spent decades maintaining the palace her fortune had saved, died in 1934. He had outlived the marriage, outlived the era that produced it, outlived most of the social world in which the transaction had made sense. His obituaries recorded his contributions to Blenheim, his public duties, the historical significance of his family. They recorded, with appropriate brevity, that he had been married to Consuelo Vanderbilt and that the marriage had ended in divorce. The transaction was footnoted. Consuelo outlived him by 30 years. She died in 1964, at 87, in a world that had become largely unrecognisable to the girl who had wept at the altar of St Thomas Church 69 years before. The British aristocracy had been transformed by 2 world wars, by death duties and income taxes, by the opening of the great houses to tourists and the National Trust. Newport was a museum. The 400 families who had defined American society in Mrs. Astor's ballroom had scattered into the general American population, their descendants living in suburbs and working in offices, the social architecture that had given their grandmothers' lives their particular shape as distant and incomprehensible as the court of Louis XIV. What remained, what had survived the dissolution of the world that produced it, was the palaces. Blenheim still stood. Flore's Castle still stood. Highclere still stood. They had passed through various difficulties and various reinventions, opened to the public, repurposed as hotels, donated to heritage organisations, preserved as examples of the architectural achievement of an era whose human costs were not generally displayed in the same rooms as the furniture. Millions of visitors walked through them each year, looking at the tapestries and the portraits and the long galleries and the formal gardens, and generally did not know the names of the American women whose money had kept these places alive long enough to become the historical landmarks they now were. The guidebooks mentioned the architects. They mentioned the ducal families who had commissioned the buildings and occupied them for generations. They mentioned the famous guests, the politicians, the monarchs, the writers, who had visited and left behind the particular kind of fame that attaches to places rather than to people. They mentioned, if they mentioned anything at all about the financial history, the general fact of declining agricultural incomes and the necessity of finding new sources of capital. They did not always mention the specific American girl whose dowry had been the capital in question. This is not malice, probably. It is simply the way that history works when the subjects of it were not, in their own era, considered to be authors of it. The women who saved the palaces were not saving them for themselves. They were delivering them, as part of a transaction they had not designed, to institutions that regarded them as temporary custodians of wealth rather than permanent members of the community. When the transaction ended, the institutions retained what the transaction had preserved. The women retained the right to call themselves former duchesses in any context where the distinction still mattered. And yet, the palaces stand. This is not nothing. Whatever the cost of their preservation, the palaces themselves are real, are genuinely beautiful, genuinely significant, containing within their walls genuine artifacts of genuine human achievement. Blenheim is beautiful. Its gardens are extraordinary. The painting by Reynolds in the Long Library, the Risbrack marble busts in the Great Hall, the Bernini fountain on the water terraces, these things are in the world, available to anyone who goes to see them, because at a critical moment a woman carried a fortune across an ocean and surrendered it to an institution that needed it. The Therese Humber case ended in 1902 with a safe that contained a brick and some buttons. The vast social fiction she had sustained for 20 years collapsed in a single afternoon. When the safe was finally opened before witnesses and the absence of its supposed contents, a fortune measured in tens of millions of francs, a will that had reorganized the financial relationships of some of the most powerful people in France, was publicly confirmed. The thing that had backed all the borrowing, all the credibility, all the salon dinners and the political connections and the mansion on the Avenue de la Grande Armée was nothing. It had always been nothing. It had been a story, maintained with such consistency and conviction that the social world of Paris had agreed, for 2 decades, to treat it as real. The victims were diverse. They included the very wealthy, an empress, the son of a president, and the very ordinary, working-class investors who had placed their savings in the certainty of a fortune that was always just out of reach, always about to be delivered, always deferred by one more legal complication in the case of the imaginary will of the imaginary millionaire. The losses were total. The money was gone. It had funded a lifestyle that no longer existed, paid for a mansion that was already being stripped by creditors, supported a fiction that had evaporated as completely as if it had never been. Therese served her sentence and disappeared. The historical record loses her, which is perhaps appropriate for a woman who had built her entire existence on disappearing into identities she had invented. She had been, for 20 years, the most credible woman in Paris, receiving the most powerful men in France in her salon, borrowing from the most sophisticated financial institutions in Europe, maintaining a social position that rested on nothing but the conviction with which she occupied it. And then she was gone. The Humbert case and the Dollar Princess phenomenon were different in their methods and different in their scales, but they were the same in their diagnosis. Both were responses to a world in which women had almost no legitimate access to the kind of social power and security that men had access to by default. Both were creative acts, in the sense that all human problem-solving is creative, the application of available intelligence to the constraints of an available situation. Both produced damage that was real and lasting, and both produced, in the process, women who had lived at a scale that the world had not intended for them. The Gilded Age ended. The world that had made the transatlantic marriage market possible dissolved in the mud of the Western Front and the upheaval of democratic reform that followed. The great estates that American money had saved found themselves facing new threats: inheritance taxes, maintenance costs, the general expense of maintaining a 19th century standard of living in a 20th century economy that no dowry could address because the pool of available dowries had dried up. The daughters of the Gilded Age were not producing daughters of the same kind. The market had one generation's worth of buyers and sellers, and when that generation was gone, the mechanism was gone with it. What was left was the record, the diaries, the letters, the memoirs, the legal documents, the accounts in the social pages, the footnotes in the architectural histories. And, in 1953, Consuelo Vanderbilt Balson's book, which said in plain language what the social pages had spent decades obscuring, that the glitter was real and the gold was real, and both of them were insufficient to compensate for the cost of the transaction, which was paid in years, and in silence, and in the distance between what a life could have been and what it was. She died at 87. She had outlived her mother by more than 30 years. She had outlived the Duke, and the palace, and the world that had sold her. She had lived in France with a man who loved her, in a house where the light came through the windows in the mornings in ways she found genuinely beautiful without having to train herself to find them so. She had written her book. She had said what she knew. The record is there for anyone who looks. The palaces are there for anyone who visits. The contradiction is there in every room of every house that American money saved. The beauty is real, and the cost was real, and neither cancels the other out. Let the contradiction rest tonight. Let it be what it is, something true and complicated and not entirely resolved, left over from a world that has been gone for a long time, carried forward only in the buildings it produced and the words the women left behind. The night is holding all of this quietly. The night holds everything quietly, that is what it is for. The echo of the transatlantic marriage market reached further into the 20th century than most histories acknowledge. Frances Ellen Work, who had married the future Baron Fermoy in 1880 and divorced him in 1891, had grandchildren who married back into English aristocracy in the following generation. Her granddaughter Ruth married into the Spencer family. Ruth's daughter Frances married Edward John Spencer, the 8th Earl Spencer, and their daughter Diana, born in 1961, grew up in the shadow of an aristocratic household and married, in 1981, the Prince of Wales. The parallel is not exact, and it would be wrong to press it too hard. Diana Spencer was not sold to Prince Charles in the way that Consuelo Vanderbilt was sold to the Duke of Marlborough. She was not coerced in the same overt sense, but the structural elements were recognizable to anyone who had read the history. A young woman from an aristocratic but not royal family, positioned by her circumstances to be a suitable match for the most prominent bachelor in the country. A marriage conducted on terms that the bride did not fully understand. A husband whose heart was elsewhere. An institution that valued the match for dynastic rather than personal reasons. And a woman who discovered, over the years that followed, that the glitter of the title she had married was not the same thing as the substance she had expected. The Dollar Princess pattern did not end with World War I, it simply changed its expression. The specific mechanism, American fortunes exchanged for European titles, was no longer available in the same form, because the world that had made it possible had been dismantled. But the underlying dynamic, women positioned to serve institutional needs rather than personal ones, valued for what they carried rather than who they were, left to discover the real terms of the transaction after the contract was already signed, persisted in different forms in different contexts. The buildings themselves became, in the 20th century, a different kind of story. Blenheim was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987, recognised as one of the finest examples of English Baroque architecture in existence. It receives hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. Its website describes its history in terms of dukes and battles and the Churchill family. The Vanderbilt connection appears, when it appears, as a note about the restoration of the water terraces. The woman who paid for those terraces with the currency of her life is mentioned, when she's mentioned at all, as an accessory to the story rather than its subject. This is not unusual, and it is not unique to Blenheim. The pattern repeats across England and Scotland and Ireland and France. Great houses that survive into the 21st century as monuments to their own grandeur, maintained by tourism, revenue and heritage organisation funding, and the general human desire to walk through rooms where history happened, without any particular acknowledgement of the specific history that kept the rooms standing long enough for history to happen in them. Consuelo's book is the corrective. It was written for exactly this purpose, to put on record in plain language the terms of the transaction that the architectural monuments obscure. The glitter was the palace, the gold was the dowry, and between the two was a life, specifically her life, and by extension the lives of the 453 other women who made the same journey, on the same terms, for the same reasons, that deserved to be seen as a life rather than as a financial instrument. The women who had chosen the other route, who had invented rather than purchased their social identities, who had built their positions from fictional materials rather than real marriages, arrived at different destinations. Thérèse Humbert served her prison sentence and disappeared into obscurity, which was probably a form of mercy. Alma Wetzera-Hain died still performing her role as an Austrian princess, a fiction so completely inhabited that the line between performance and belief had by the end perhaps dissolved entirely. The women who had commissioned their coats of arms from heraldic artists and used them on their stationery for 20 years lived, in most cases, with their fictions intact, neither exposed nor exactly vindicated, simply absorbed into the general ambiguity of a social world that preferred not to examine its own foundations too closely. The Gilded Age ended. The world that had made all of this possible, the enormous new American fortunes, the crumbling English estates, the specific combination of need and ambition that had produced the market, dissolved in the upheaval of the early 20th century. What remained was the record, and the buildings, and the memoir of a woman who had been there and told the truth about it. The financial record of the transatlantic marriage market, examined at the level of individual transactions, reveals a detail that the aggregate figures obscure. The timing mattered as much as the quantity. A dowry paid in 1895 was, for the family that provided it, a present expenditure with a future return, the title, the position, the social legitimacy, that was expected to compound over time in the way that a well-placed investment might. The return came in the first years of the marriage, when the new duchess or countess was received and acknowledged and included in the social calculus of her new world. But dowries, once paid, could not be recovered. The capital had transferred across the ocean and into the estate, and if the estate subsequently proved to be not the investment that the transaction had implied, but rather a drain, an obligation requiring continuous infusions of American capital to maintain at the promised level, then the original dowry was simply the first payment of many. Helena Zimmerman's story was the arithmetic of this at its most transparent. The initial settlement was followed by regular requests for more, each request framed as temporary, and each request establishing the precedent for the next. The women who understood this early enough tried to protect what remained. Some of them, with the help of fathers or brothers who had witnessed the deterioration from a distance, structured their subsequent payments as trusts rather than transfers, as capital held in reserve rather than delivered outright, accessible to the marriage only under conditions that the trustees could enforce. This was imperfect protection. It generated resentment and sometimes legal proceedings. But it was better than the alternative, which was the complete and irrecoverable transfer of a fortune into a household from which there was no retrieval. The Zimmerman Trust, which Eugene Zimmerman had constructed before his death to protect Helena from the Duke's direct access to the remaining capital, was a late and limited intervention, but it mattered. It meant that when the marriage finally ended in 1931, Helena emerged with something, Not what she had entered with, not the full fortune that the Zimmerman oil money had produced, but something. The Duke had challenged the will and lost. The trust had held, and Helena, at 51, had enough left to build a second life that was quieter and in the end considerably more worth living than the first. The Therese Humbert affair did not end the appetite for similar fictions. It ended perhaps the particular naivety that had allowed her specific version of the fiction to persist so long. After 1902, the creditors who had funded the Great Safe were somewhat more cautious about next time, somewhat more inclined to verify, somewhat less willing to defer to the confidence of a woman whose collateral existed only in a story. But the market for stories, for the performed certainty of wealth and position and connection, remained. It had always been there. It predated Therese Humbert, and it survived her exposure. The specific techniques changed. The underlying appetite did not. What the era produced in the end was not simply a set of remarkable women. It produced a set of remarkably legible questions about the nature of identity and the relationship between what is performed and what is real. Questions that the 21st century has returned to with renewed urgency, finding in the Gilded Age not a period to be condescended to for its naivety, but a precursor to its own complicated negotiations between authenticity and presentation, between the self that is given and the self that is made. The women in these rooms, the genuine duchesses and the invented countesses, the forced brides and the resourceful impostors, were working on problems that have not been solved. They were simply working on them earlier with fewer tools and at a cost that is easier to account when it falls entirely on a woman rather than distributed across a network of anonymous transactions. Somewhere in a Fifth Avenue bedroom, a woman is choosing her name. The room is warm. The candles are lit and burning low. The city outside the window has gone quiet in the particular way that cities go quiet in the deep middle of the night, when even the people who never sleep have finally, for a few hours, let themselves rest. The gaslight in the corridor has dimmed to its overnight setting. The house is still. She's sitting at a writing desk. There is a piece of paper in front of her, and on it, in her own handwriting, is a name. It is not the name she was given. It is the name she has chosen, or purchased, or married into, or claimed by some mechanism more or less honest, more or less sanctioned, more or less recognized by the world that will read it on an invitation, or a calling card, or a marriage announcement in the newspapers tomorrow. The name is there. Whatever it cost, it is there. The story of the women in these rooms is not a simple one. It is not the story of victims and villains, though it contains both. It is not the story of heroines and fraudsters, though it contains those too. It is the story of what women do when the available world is too small for the size of what they want, when the legitimate channels are closed and the illegitimate ones are the only ones that lead anywhere. It is a story about the gap between the life that was offered and the life that was demanded, and about the extraordinary, costly, sometimes beautiful, sometimes devastating things that happen in that gap. The candle is almost out. The paper is folded. The name is sealed inside an envelope that will be delivered in the morning, and by the time it is read, the woman who wrote it will have committed herself to whatever the name requires. Outside, the night continues on its own schedule, indifferent to names and titles and the social machinery that produces them. The stars are the same stars that hung over Blenheim and Newport and Paris, and the south of France, where a woman eventually gardened in peace. The dark is the dark that holds all of it, the glitter and the gold and the gap between them, with equal quiet indifference. Let the dark hold you too for a while. There is nothing more that needs to be done tonight. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. And one question to leave you with, if you'd like to answer in the comments. If you had lived in the Gilded Age as an ambitious new money family, or as one of the daughters being positioned for a title, what do you think you would have done? I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there tonight.